"I wonder, Mrs. Barclay, if I could work in the cabin, by the light from the casements. 'Tis so much easier than seeking to keep accounts by candlelight, and I have a great deal of catching up to do."
Emily, in the act of writing home to her mother, was taken slightly unawares. Gerson had not knocked, but entered unannounced. But then Shenton did that all the time, while pretending he did not know how much it discomforted her.
"I fear my eyes are not as strong as they should be."
The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Emily to think that Gerson was being less than entirely honest. Not that she could swear to such a thing, only that his words were at odds with the cast of his features, as well as the look in his eye, which was direct enough to be unsettling. Fearing to speak, lest she convey her doubts as to his motives, she nodded and pointed her quill to the footlockers and the cushions she had embroidered with the ship's name, then went, very obviously, back to her writing. It was hard to concentrate. The thread of her letter had been lost, and it was impossible to ignore Gerson carefully laying out, then standing to study his ledgers on those cushions. Finally he went to the furthest point from her, where the bulkhead of the side cabin met the stern, and sat down, at an angle which had him almost directly facing the table at which she sat.
"Please, Mrs. Barclay, do say if I am disturbing you in any way. It would trouble me greatly if it were so."
Was that a strange choice of words? So ambiguous as to be beyond response. Emily came to the firm conclusion that she did not like the man. He had an oleaginous manner, and an air of misplaced superiority. Added to that, she suspected his testimony at the court-martial had been as tainted as all the others, which made him a willing liar. Fortunately, there was little prospect of her needing to have much contact with him. Had she been able to see inside Cornelius Gerson's mind, she would have been less sanguine. To him he had merely fired the opening salvo in a campaign of indeterminate duration. Seduction was an art at which he prided himself. He reckoned he could charm men out of the trees like birds, and women too, though they required a more delicate form of flattery. Tell a plain woman she was beautiful, treat beauty in one who possessed it with indifference. As he scratched away with his quill, totting up the columns of figures for stores acquired and used, he allowed himself an occasional lift of the eye to look at Emily Barclay. How long would it take? That was an unknown, but he knew the first bridge to be the hardest to cross. The idea that dalliance was possible. Once a woman had accepted the possibility of infidelity, the rest of the defence would crumble, slowly, for sure, but inexorably. The pleasure it would bring to both parties could not be in doubt. How could an old goat like Ralph Barclay compete in the bedchamber with a young buck like him? Let her get used to his being present first, then he could move on to being familiar, then friendly, and finally a person to confide in. That delicious train of thought was interrupted as Shenton barged in with his usual lack of regard for proper behaviour. Emily had long since given up chastising him because he paid no attention, and the time was long past when saying anything to her husband would have seen his servant put in his place. But it was telling the way he stopped dead, looking from her to Gerson, separated by the width of the cabin and the table at which she was writing, clear on his face the notion that something was going on which should not be. Odd, thought Emily, how that pleases me. And he is bound to tell my husband, which pleases me even more. For Ralph Barclay, the prospect of Hotham's dinner rose as the morning went by. Anything was better than being out here trying to impede the progress of the French gunners as they tried to construct new battery positions. His was at Fort Mulgrave, a bastion thrown up and named after the military commander of the Toulon garrison. Right at this moment, he was engaged in an artillery duel against an opposite number who seemed willing to push his guns forward into extremely exposed positions, obviously content to take the casualties this caused. It was no joy to see approaching the redoubt that pint-sized pest, Horatio Nelson, fresh back from Naples. "Nelson," he said, deliberately concentrating on the use of his telescope to avoid direct eye contact.
"Captain Barclay, 'tis so very good to see you again."
What is he about? Ralph Barclay thought. Is he so dense that he cannot see I do not esteem him? He would not admit to a tinge of jealousy. Nelson was not far above him in the captain's list, but he had been favoured by Lord Hood in a way that had been denied to him. It was all to do with Rodney, of course. Hood hated that name, even if the bearer was dead and buried and almost forgotten, except by those who had admired him and prospered by their association. He could not see Nelson without recalling he was a client of Hood, who had held the power of appointment at the outbreak of this war as the senior naval sea lord on the Board of Admiralty. Lord Chatham, William Pitt's brother, who held the position of First Sea Lord, was an idle fool, often drunk and never very active, which left Hood making all the important decisions. Nelson had got Agamemnon, a 64-gun ship of the line. He had got the smallest class of frigate in the King's Navy. That train of irritation was broken by a salvo from the nearest well-set French guns, a battery they had called Sablette, as it was near the sandy shoreline. It was obvious they were seeking to suppress any fire on another battery position even closer to the fort, which the French sappers were busy extending with anything that came to hand. Broken wagons, balks of timber of all shapes and sizes, plus mounds of freshly dug earth.
"He is a bold fellow,"
Nelson said, shading his eyes as he looked out over the undulating landscape.
"He may be a dead fellow soon, Nelson."
With that, Ralph Barclay gave orders for his naval gunners to train their cannon round on the men digging hard to raise that earthwork.
"I want that mound knocked down, lads, and damn quick." "No easy task, Captain Barclay," Nelson responded in that high-pitched voice which so irritated many of his fellow officers. "Loose earth will do naught but absorb the balls, and the range is too great for case shot to kill the sappers."
Why has this poltroon come here to tell me the obvious? Does he suspect I do not know?
"What we really need is soldiers to go out and take the ground," Barclay said. "But we lack them, as you know. Every available man is employed." "There is a draft on the way from Naples, sir, a substantial one. Perhaps when they are here we can sally out and undo the efforts of whoever commands yonder." "I will believe that when I see the glint of their bayonets."
Another ball from Sablette bounced in front of Fort Mulgrave before sinking into the glacis built before it.
"Sir John Acton was most pressing in his commitment."
Ralph Barclay finally looked down at Nelson, noting not for the first time the absurdly youthful countenance, the lack of inches, and those eyes so blue they were like sapphires, before he checked himself for thinking such poetic drivel. The man mentioned, Acton, was a power in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, close to the Queen, Maria Carolina, and rumoured to be her lover. The real ruler, her husband, King Ferdinand, was apparently a slobbering idiot whose only interests were hunting and fornication, so the task of running the country was left to his wife. As a daughter of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, her bloodline promised competence, not that it was guaranteed. Her sister, Marie Antoinette, whom many blamed for undermining the French monarchy, was at this very moment incarcerated in a Paris dungeon. Still, it was remarkable that an Englishman should have achieved such a post in a foreign government, but not as extraordinary as the kingdom in which he served. Naples was by rumour the loosest and most corrupt place in creation, where every wife had a lover, every husband had one or more mistresses, a place where dishonesty was the norm, not the exception. How could it be otherwise with such a sovereign?
"You do not fear that Sir John Acton has gone native?"
That remark coincided with the next shot from the French, which had a bigger charge, or a ball that better fitted the barrel from which it was fired. It cleared the rampart and hit an empty wagon sitting at the rear of the battery, rendering it to matchwood. Berkeley gave orders for the guns, now ready and aimed, to commence their counter-battery fire, and suddenly the two captains were engulfed in clouds of acrid smoke as the breeze, which aided the enemy fire, blew back the residue of their own weapons into their faces.
"In what way gone native?"
Nelson asked, once the smoke had cleared, and he had removed with a handkerchief some of the bits of burnt powder that had stuck to his cheeks. Berkeley took time to reply, busy marking the fall of shot and ordering an increased elevation.
"In making promises, Captain Nelson, that he has no intention of meeting." "Sir William assures me he has not."
"Hamilton?"
"Who else?"
"You met him?"
"I did, and a better representative of England's needs could scarce be found. The man is tireless in his pursuit of our nation's interests."
"What about his trollop?"
"Trollop?"
Nelson looked shocked, which made him look even younger than normal.
"I do hope, Captain Berkeley, you are not referring to his wife, the inestimable Lady Hamilton?"
There was great temptation, then, to ask if Nelson had fallen for the lady's charms. After all, if a woman who had whored in London could capture the heart and loins of an old and noble knight, a friend of King George when young and related to a duke, this soft Norfolk fool would be like putty in her hands. Instead, he said, "You found her acceptable?"
"More than that, sir. She is in possession of accomplishments that are quite astounding, is fluent in Italian, German, and French, aided by not only natural beauty, but a charming and elegant disposition."
His fellow captain was thinking he had been right. He had fallen for her, the ninny.
"Also," Nelson went on, "she has the ear of the Queen, and is, if I may say so, as important in the affairs of the embassy as her husband. The alacrity with which the court of Naples agreed to send troops to our aid has a great deal to do with her powers of persuasion."
"Is it not amazing, Nelson," said Ralph Berkeley, looking right at him for once, "the heights to which some people can rise, given they have little in the way of a decent background to recommend them?"
Horatio Nelson completely missed the irony, which was in part aimed at him. "Ability, sir. We live in an age where it cannot be gainsaid. Let us not think that blood is the only measure of success in these times. I have nothing but a distant connection to the Orford earldom to qualify me for natural elevation, yet I believe I have a destiny to do great service for England."
He had to look away then. There was such certainty in those blue eyes. It was hard for Ralph Berkeley to deal with someone like Nelson, who left himself so open to ridicule, though there was the advantage that, when it was employed, it did seem to go right over his head. Conversation was again killed by gunfire, and this time some of the earthwork thrown up by the French was displaced, and in such a way that there must have been losses. "I will take your word for it regarding Hamilton's wife, sir, not having met the lady. But she is by reputation very different."
"I fear reputation is a poor way to judge a person, Captain. 'Tis often the malice of the less able that forms it." Sensitive always to a potential affront, that remark got Nelson a sharp look, and that was not aided when he said, "I believe you are to be congratulated on the result of your court. I'm sorry I missed it." The words, "I'm not," were formed, but like so much that had gone before, left unsaid. He had a horrible vision of Nelson sitting as court president, and it was enough to make Ralph Berkeley shudder. His next words he issued with gusto, well aware of their pomposity. "We arrived at the truth, sir, and that is all that a man can ask." "Well said, Captain Berkeley, well said."
"Thank God our guns are more accurate than his perception," Ralph Berkeley thought, "or England would be in dire straits." Emily Berkeley was, that afternoon, no happier to find herself next to Nelson than Ralph Berkeley had been by his company earlier. In the nature of things, she was not seated next to her spouse. He had been placed within easy conversational distance of Rear Admiral Gardner, Hood's third in line of command, which presented to Ralph Berkeley a chance to make himself known to another senior officer who might have some input into his future prospects. To Emily, this Nelson was a sneak who had told her husband how much she had enjoyed the assembly-room dance in Sheerness, the very night the men from Brilliant had been out pressing seamen. And his voice was not one to endear, especially when he had taken several glasses of wine, which seemed to affect him greatly. "I cannot tell you, Mrs. Berkeley, how the core of Naples glitters. Sir William—" Seeing her confusion, he added, "Hamilton, our plenipotentiary there. He and his wife took me out to view the royal palace at Caserta, which has to be a wonder of the world, bigger than Versailles, which he has also seen." Emily was only half listening as Nelson told her of hundreds of rooms, of painted walls and ceilings, with a sort of descriptive ineptitude that rendered them dull, of statuary and furniture in such abundance that she wondered if there was room for humans. Politeness forced her to respond, but it did not mean that she had to concur with his enthusiasm. "I must say, Captain Nelson, it does all sound a trifle excessive." "Mrs. Berkeley, I confess to a love of that, while I, sir, am proud to claim an admiration for the plain." "Then might I suggest that you avoid a looking-glass?" As an attempt at flattery, or perhaps even dalliance, it was seriously inept, especially from a married man, and Nelson seemed to realize very quickly he had pushed the bounds of good taste, for he added quickly, "You must be very pleased at the outcome of your husband's court." As soon as he said that, Emily engaged her neighbour to the right in earnest conversation. "Gould, I have no ideas what I said to so upset her, but I can tell you Mrs. Berkeley hardly exchanged another word with me." They were walking on the quarterdeck of Britannia, taking some air, while the other guests smoked their pipes and downed their port. Davidge Gould, who knew Nelson of old, and also knew of his clumsiness with members of the opposite sex, gave the only reply he could. "I'm sure, sir, you are mistaken. I know the lady to be kindness herself and a joy in company." "You devil," Nelson replied with a twinkle in his eye, "do not think I cannot recall how you danced with her in Sheerness. I was not the only one to mark the enjoyment you took in each other's company." "It was, sir," Gould protested, "entirely innocent of any other interpretation but amusement." "You sailed with Berkeley, did you not, Gould? How did you find him?" "Irascible, sir, to begin with, and he did stretch his orders somewhat to take a prize." Nelson smiled. "Can a man go to excess to gain a prize?" "Convoy orders leave little room for interpretation, sir. Captain Berkeley was out of sight of his charges, though I have to confess that I allowed myself to be persuaded he had not done so, and wrote up my logs accordingly." "Gould!" Nelson laughed, slapping him on the back. "I hope then one day you sail with me." "I am given to understand you are off on another cruise, sir." "I am, with Lindsay. We are to look into Algiers and have words with the Dey about supplies, and not interfering with our trade." "An impossible task." "Rumour has it there is a French warship there, Gould, so there is a chance we will see some action." Ralph Berkeley had left the dinner to relieve himself at the Heads, Hotham being no lover of the obvious chamber pot, and in returning he could hardly avoid the two promenading officers. "Berkeley!" called Nelson. "I was just telling Gould here I'm off to Tangier under Commodore Lindsay." "What?" Gould was looking at Berkeley, Nelson was not, and as the smaller man enthused regarding the possibilities of his cruise and a fight with a Frenchman, it was very obvious that if he upset Emily Berkeley at dinner, he had just done the same thing to her husband, who growled his response, which was only correct in word, not tone, then stomped off. "I think I must get to know Berkeley better, Mr. Gould. After all, he appears a fellow who will seek action even if his orders constrain him. In short, my kind of officer." How much has he had to drink? Gould wondered. Chapter 18. The captain of HMS Farran was quite emphatic, which was important, given he was not speaking in French, and he wanted to convey that he was serious. "Captain Moreau, I have my orders and I will obey them." He then turned to Pearce and requested that he translate. What followed was to Henry Digby incomprehensible, but there was no question it was a protest, and not just from Moreau. Jacquelin in particular was incensed, but then he was the more zealous when it came to the revolution. Digby was forced to continue over the babble. "Please also be so good as to tell our friends that I have the means to enforce those orders, and I will employ them." Pearce was not enjoying this. He could see the need. In fact, he shared with his captain the notion that it was a first-rate idea. But while Digby was issuing the unpleasant news, he, being the one understood, was taking the entire backwash. Moreau was glaring at him as if he had betrayed a friendship, while Garnier had a hangdog, sad expression that was just as wounding. The other two he cared little for, either their person or their opinion, but to fall in the estimation of the two aforementioned distressed him. Time spent in their company at Gibraltar had deepened their acquaintance. "We will weather the Ile d'Oléron, and out of close sight of any lookouts," Digby went on. "I will take station on your lee, and I will run out my guns. Any attempt by your vessels to bear up for the Charente estuary will be met by force. Now be so good as to return to your ships and hold your course for La Rochelle. Mr. Pearce, in French, if you please." That set off another bout of complaint, and Pearce got seriously annoyed with Digby, who could sit there with an air of complacent indifference while he had to listen to a litany of reasons why that port was unsuitable for anything other than a decent frigate. All the reasons they had discussed were aired by the French, yet they must have realized it was to no avail. Disobey, and they would have Ferron on their quarter ready once more to pour shot into their undefended stern, an act which, if sustained, would bring about serious casualties. "You may also say, Mr. Pearce, that now we have cleared Gibraltar, I see no reason for the continued flying of their royal ensign. You may give them permission from me to rehoist their tricolour pennants." A small measure to mollify them, it barely succeeded, only the stupid Forçat appearing to be openly pleased. Moreau saw it for what it was, a sop to his dented pride, but the Frenchman kept his most wounding remarks for his exit through the gangway, turning to Pearce, no engaging smile now, but a furrowed and angry brow. "I know what you are seeking to achieve, and it is dishonourable. If I had a single cannon, monsieur, I would decline to accept this demand and fight you." It was hyperbole, both men knew it, yet it was telling. "What did he say, Mr. Pearce?" asked Digby. Pearce let his own frustrations spill over then. After all, his captain would be unaware of the exaggeration. "I'm afraid, sir, he likened us to the more solid contents of a chamber pot." "Damn cheek." Sailing north past Corunna and Cape Ortega, the weather turned exceptionally mild, with 2 days of sunshine and soft westerly breezes that wafted the ships along at a steady pace, devoid of haste on a sea of long, slow, rolling waves. The early parts of the evening were warm too, and under a series of glorious sunsets, which turned into the canopy of the Milky Way as night fell, and before the clear skies sucked out all the heat of the day, the crew would gather after their duties were complete to entertain themselves with songs, ditties, and music from makeshift instruments. The carpenter was a dab hand on his saw. Sykes had fashioned a penny whistle, and Digby had gifted another fellow a pair of spoons with which he beat out a rhythm. There had been few chances for the Pelicans to foregather, though it was no secret aboard that John Pearce had a connection to Michael, Rufus, and Charlie that transcended the bounds of his rank, as well as a soft spot for Latimer and Blubber Booth, and looking from the quarterdeck to the bows, he itched to join them in their revels, a fact which he thought he kept hidden, but was clear to anyone who cared to look. "I think the men should be encouraged, don't you?" asked Digby, his perception once more acute. "Perhaps if you were to ask them if they would like lanterns, Mr. Pearce, so that they may see better when the sun finally goes?" That he did, and the men were grateful enough to invite the officers to join with them. Digby felt that his own dignity permitted him to witness but not to participate, and had a chair fetched for the purpose. But he saw it as his duty to insist that his midshipmen should learn the art of singing a song in public and be taught the steps of the hornpipe. "Then perhaps ashore, my lads, you may behave with a little more decorum, instead of forever trying to stab the locals." Both looked abashed at mention of their bout at Toulon, the scar of which, though fading, Harbin still bore. Lutyens brought out another chair and one of his little notebooks, occasionally scribbling something while the activities went on. "What the hell is he about with that there pencil?" whispered Harbin. "He's ever at it. I've seen him more than once." "Nothing, Dick," Fairmelot replied in a similar low tone. "He was the same aboard Brilliant. We all got used to it, and now pay it no heed." "And Mr. Pearce," Digby called to his second, who was already amongst the crew, "if you feel your nautical education would benefit from the experience, I would say you too should participate in a hornpipe." If it had been anyone else, Pearce would have suspected an attempt to diminish him, but not Digby. "I fear, sir, that the kind of dancing I learnt in the ballroom would scarcely answer on a ship's deck, and I doubt if there is one aboard as fleet of foot as a lady to accompany me." "I'll be your partner, John boy," O'Hagan joked in his ear. "And I'll show you a reel that'll spin your toes." Pearce burst out laughing. "What a pair we would make, Michael!" Blubber Booth was on his feet, and as the bent saw sang, the whistle piped, and the spoons paced a soft rattle, he began to dance, arms folded across his chest, showing a surprising lightness of feet for a man of his size. Latimer then sang a fisherman's song, in a voice that had more gravel than musicality, that followed by Dysart reciting a warlike Scottish poem by the Lord of Stair, which he had learnt off by heart. That it damned every Englishman born or yet to be conceived was taken in good part by the rest. Harbin hornpiped with little grace, but Fairmelot, a taller, more elegant creature, took his instruction well, as Pearce said to the Pelicans, who were all sitting close to him now. "There are times, friends, when this we have been forced into has its moments of true pleasure." This is how it seemed to Pearce now. A calm sea with an air of camaraderie and no feeling of hierarchy, which brought back a fond recollection of the time he had occupied the captain's cabin of HMS Weasel. "We have had few, Pearce," said Charlie Taverner, though in a rare show of graciousness he added, "though I will not dispute with you that this is pleasant." "Do you still hanker for the liberties, Charlie?" That made Charlie pensive. His life in those crowded Thameside streets had not been pleasant. A cramped space in which to sleep, shared with 3 others, work some days but few, and always for an employer who would dispute the due wage. For food it was often a scavenge rather than a buy, evenings spent in taverns like the Pelican, usually without the means to purchase a whet, and certainly never the coin to tease a wench, or just sitting watching the filth of the River Thames float by, for want of the means to do anything different. The night they had met, Charlie had dunned John Pearce out of the means to buy drinks with an ease that was habitual. But he could not go a few streets to the hunting grounds where, before he was forced to hide from the law, he had made his way. The Strand and the narrow streets and open market of Covent Garden were barred to him by the existence of a warrant for his arrest. "I hanker for the right to go where I please, John." "I don't recall you had that, Charlie," said Michael. "For sure you had better, for you had that. Come and go as you please it was for you. Why you ever came to our part of the world, when you could have gone anywhere for your amusement, I'll never know." Michael gave Charlie a gentle poke in the chest. "There was a certain apple-cheeked wench called Rosie, you might recall." "I recall you buff more on her cheeks," Charlie replied with some asperity, for plump Rosie had been a bone of contention between them. Michael could afford to treat her with his daily earnings. Charlie, far better off in the article of looks and wit, could not, and that jealousy had been slow to fade, if indeed it ever had. "I take it," asked Pearce, "the ladies of Spain saw to your needs on the Rock?" That had both men grinning and nudging, though Rufus looked embarrassed, and the mention of that set the men closest to singing the song which was so well known it was taken up by everyone. Rufus piped up as the last verse faded. "I never took to the liberties." "Just as you never took to being bonded," Pearce insisted. "I wish I'd never left home. There was much there to enjoy. I used to like to attend the goose fair when I was a lad." "What do you mean, when, shaver?" Charlie scoffed. "You still are." Rufus would not be put off, going on to describe in enticing detail the stalls, the conjurers, acrobats, dancers, and singers of the annual pre-Christmas fair. There was a wistful air to it, for it bespoke of a life that preceded his being a bonded apprentice to a harsh employer in the leather trade. Yet he had the others salivating with him at his talk of hot meat pies filled with beef or lamb, spit-roasting pork, sweetmeats served by comely wenches, fresh brewed special ale so strong they had everyone cavorting by darkness. "I will go to that one day," said Michael, "for both the ale and the comely wenches." "Then have a care," Rufus replied gravely. "The watchmen carry stout clubs, and will clout anyone causing trouble." "Me? Cause trouble? Never in life. Sure, I'm as placid in drink as a Wicklow cow." That made them laugh, and wondering at the joke it was soon shared, so that insults of a joshing kind were soon flying around the deck. Michael, called upon, did an Irish reel that made up in sheer brio for what it lacked in polish, and Charlie did a few tricks, such as taking a coin from behind another sailor's ear, having put it in his mouth, a mock argument breaking out when he tried to pocket the object he had been given for the act. Night fell, and the sky became a mass of twinkling stars so closely packed that they seemed like a sheet drawn across the black. From across the water, under the lanterns rigged by the Frenchmen, came the sound of mass singing. Clearly they had no notion to be outdone by their escort, and even although it was that revolutionary anthem Ça ira, it was hard to imagine at this moment that the two nations were at war. "Mr. Pearce, if you care to join me in my cabin, we may partake of some toasted cheese and a glass of wine." What seemed like an innocent invitation soon turned out to be something else. Pearce knew as they ate and drank that Digby was building himself up to something, and when it came it was as unpleasant an idea as Pearce could imagine. "The problem is, we need someone to go ashore with a flag of truce and tell whoever is in control of La Rochelle of our mission, and get them to accept their sailors." "Do you, sir, know the meaning of the French expression, déjà vu?" "Of course," Digby replied with just a trace of asperity. "Then you will know that I was so charged with the same task by Lord Hood at Toulon." "Were you? I was not aware. And I would point out that I nearly forfeited my life in trying to comply with his instructions." "You will be under a white flag." "You know, sir, because I have told you, I have some experience of the politics of revolution, and I also have some hope that you understand this simple fact. The normal rules of chivalrous exchange do not always apply when dealing with such people. They see themselves as fighting the forces of reaction with a conviction that borders on the religious, and anything that can be done to defeat that force is seen as legitimate." "They might not respect a truce flag?" Obviously, to Digby the notion was outrageous. To John Pearce he was again showing that parochial Achilles' heel that he had noted before. To someone raised like his captain, the idea that anyone would do such a thing was incomprehensible. War had rules, and they must be observed. The only problem was, if he was wrong, he would not face the consequences. "Is there any other way that we can communicate with them?" "If there is, Mr. Pearce, I'm damned if I can see it. Even if we had the means to signal such a complicated message, they could scarce read it. And I cannot see anyone putting a boat off to bespeak us when we give the appearance of being 5 fully operational warships." "They might," Pearce replied, clutching at the only available straw. "We cannot wait for them, for we must employ haste, and that for all the reasons we have already discussed. If we linger, Mr. Pearce, and the weather turns, it might be us that is slung on shore and drowned in the process, and that takes no cognizance of us getting into a battle with a superior force."
"What if they refuse to accept them, sir?"
"Then tell them they have the choice of doing so or watching them drown. That will concentrate their thinking."
Pearce felt the air go out of his lungs at the same time as any resistance he had collapsed. Digby could not comprehend, did not know any more than Pearce who was in charge in La Rochelle. It was beyond his understanding that the representatives of the people who ran the revolution, those who had retaken Marseille and were bent on recapturing Lyons, were perfectly capable of watching 5,000 men drown for the sake of their militant purity.
"Then you'd best get the yeoman of the sheets to cut me out a couple of squares of thin bleached canvas."
"Good man."
The approach was not straightforward, given they had to weather the Ile d'Oléron, really a long, low-lying island, more sandbar than rock, which jutted out into the Bay of Biscay and formed the protection for the anchorage termed on the British charts the Aix Roads. As well as that, it also protected from the southwest the Charente estuary, and upriver the naval port of Rochefort. There would be lookouts on the westernmost tip of the island to give advance warning to Rochefort of any approaching armada, as well as boats out fishing the offshore waters, which ensured they would be seen. Those with the wit could now see that Digby's idea to let his chargers fly the tricolor at their masthead made perfect sense. Bourbon ensigns in this part of France might set off all sorts of alarms. "Mr. Harbin," he had said as the first sign of land came into view, "I believe you will find in Mr. Pearce's quarters the French flag he took from Apollon off Marseille. Be so good as to fetch it, with his permission, of course, and raise it to the masthead."
He looked out at his 4 chargers. Would they guess his game when he himself raised the same flag as they? There had to be warships in Rochefort of a size that he could not face. If they supposed a squadron of their own capital ships were heading north, they would not stir. The real worry was the possibility of 1 or more frigates patrolling well offshore to give added advance warning of any threat. So far, nothing had been observed.
"I would have them closer inshore, sir," said Nimes when asked, "between Oleron and the Isles of Aix. With all these fishermen out in the deep waters, they have plenty of eyes to see approaching trouble." "Then let us hope that the outlines of those 74s are not too familiar to your fishermen," Digby replied. "I would not want them to identify vessels that were dispatched to the Mediterranean. A sharp eye on our friends yonder, for if they are going to try to break away, this is the time to do it."
Martin Dent was in the tops again with one duty, to observe the French quarterdecks for any sign of excessive activity. Digby had executed a mighty bluff, leaving the captains in no doubt that he would treat them as hostile, and even the ordinary cannon of HMS Farron's armament, in vessels so crowded, could kill and maim men in their hundreds. There was another lookout on the foremast, with his telescope trained due east. If anything was essaying out of Rochefort, Henry Digby needed to know quickly, for if something too formidable emerged, he would be obliged to turn tail and run. The twin stone towers that guarded the narrow entry to the port of La Rochelle were visible now, the pale brown weathered stone lit by the rays of a sinking sun, that same light showing the tip of the cathedral spire above the line of the fortified sea wall, and the slate roofs of warehouses come dwellings that lined the quays. South of where the warships had anchored lay a marshy area on a promontory called Les Minimes, while another shallow bay, full of small fishing smacks, lay directly to the north of the main port, forming part of the defences of the municipality. It was obvious that they too could be seen as they prepared to drop anchor, and that must be causing no end of speculation in the town. In the bows of Apollon, a sailor was casting a lead to check the depth of water under the keel, which was shoaling slowly but inexorably to the point where they too must anchor. Digby left it to Moreau to decide when that would be. "Our flags notwithstanding, they will send a messenger to Rochefort, and the distance is not more than 50 miles.
I think we can expect a reaction, so we must be away from here as quickly as we can."
Pearce looked doubtful. "I would rather go in at first light, sir. I want that truce flag to be in plain view."
"I confess to being torn. I have no wish to overrule you in this, but the needs of the service must, as they always do, transcend those of any one person. I suggest you take a boat in to within hailing distance of those towers. See if you can establish anything tonight. With luck, they may agree to let you land on the morrow."
Ancient they might be, but the La Rochelle towers, as well as the sea wall that ran to the south and west of that, were still equipped with cannon, and approaching, he would be the only target rowing into a narrowing arc of fire. It was a nervous Pearce who sat in the thwarts, wishing he was rowing with his back to any threat, not sitting facing it.
Dysart had stepped a mast, but it was rigged with no sail. Instead, stiff on the offshore breeze, there flew a white flag. If that did not excite conjecture, nothing would. Why would a vessel with a tricolor at the masthead need such a thing as a flag of truce? There was no doubt that they had manned the defences, probably as soon as the topsails of the leading 74 had been sighted, and Pearce could see wisps of smoke rising from behind the walls and atop the triple tower called St. Nicholas that stood, the higher of the two, on the southern edge of the port entrance. Heated shot, or just warming braziers for the gunners, he did not know, but he needed little of his already vivid imagination to see this flimsy cutter blown to smithereens, and the men rowing so steadily, crying for mercy as they drowned, given it was very likely not one of them could swim. As soon as he decently could, he raised his speaking trumpet and called out to the tower, until a voice, carried on the wind, insisted he identify himself. Pearce had considered lying, putting forth the tale that he too was French, and asking for permission to land the evacuees as men in need of medical care. But that would soon be exploded as a lie, the minute the first Frenchman set foot on shore. So there was no choice but to identify himself as a British officer, making a very exaggerated gesture to indicate the white flag, and ask for permission to come closer and parley. What followed was long-winded and difficult, with much being made of fair and flying false colours, which necessitated apologies and the need not to alert the town and cause panic. His interlocutor, whom he could not see, was not easily convinced that what he was being told was true, so Pearce asked only for permission to come ashore at dawn under a laissez-passer, when he could fully explain to whoever had power in the town what was needed. He was left drifting off the tower while messengers were dispatched to whoever that might be, and it was dark by the time the answer came back. That he could come in only as far as he had this evening, when he would be asked to repeat what he had said to the head of the local committee of public safety. That made him swear under his breath, before he gave orders to get back to the ship. "That means, sir, the place is attached to Paris and the Revolution." "I had been hoping for another Toulon," said Digby. "I have alluded to this before, sir. What do we do if the leading citizens of La Rochelle refuse to accept these men?" "Don't think I have not thought on it, Pearce. I fear if they do that, we will have to abandon our charges and retrace our course, leaving them to decide their final destination. There is, in truth, no more that we can do. If you do not know we are engaged in a massive bluff, it would disappoint me. There is no possible way I could burn or seek to sink those ships with men still aboard, nor would I leave fellow sailors, whatever their politics, to drown by being driven ashore." "I never thought you would, sir." "So we require your very best efforts, Mr. Pearce. On your shoulders tomorrow rests the success or failure of our intentions." The "thank you" that received was larded with irony. Chapter 19. Pearce could not know, as he took to the cutter the next morning, what he was rowing into. News of a rising in the Vendée had filtered through to the Mediterranean, but not the extent of the rebellion against Paris. In truth, there had been such a spate of uprising against the same central authority that the one happening here, in the lands bordering the Atlantic, was not seen as exceptional by those outside France. Yet it was just that, a revolt led not by people seeking to temper revolutionary excess while keeping the gains of 1789, but a full-scale insurrection, an army led by real soldiers and encouraged by priests, aimed at a restoration of the Bourbon monarchy and the re-establishment of the Catholic Church. Thus it was that the strategic town and port of La Rochelle was under the jurisdiction of the most zealous kind of diehard, a representative on mission from Paris, who knew that the cause they espoused could only be maintained by a reign of terror. The guillotine had been set up in the main square before the Hôtel de Ville, renamed, as every major space in France had been, Place de la Révolution, and anyone with even a hint of sympathy for the rebels, called the Chouans, had already been decapitated. Even before that, the cobbles of the square had been well stained by the blood of the wealthy and the aristocratic, many of whom had fled to this place hoping to take ship to safety in the Americas. The majority of the citizenry went in fear of their lives, while the dregs of local society, the ambitious demagogues, the bitter failures, and the bare-assed discontented, had risen to prominence. There was no shouting up to an unseen voice behind the embrasures this morning. A delegation had come down to the tiny quay that stood before the Romanesque northern tower, La Chaîne. Pearce could see several blue uniform coats, frogged with gold decoration, and a sloppy body of men behind them in National Guard clothing, bearing muskets. But the man who took his eye most was wearing the livery of those who held power in this benighted land. A black coat with a high-backed collar, and the same colour breeches inside highly polished boots. On his head he wore a tall hat with an imposing cockade, and round his waist a wide sash of red, white, and blue. His face was sallow, the mouth, framed by long drooping moustaches, unsmiling. Pearce knew, even before the first exchange, that this was the man with whom he would have to deal.
"Please heave to," a voice called. "Do not approach any closer."
Pearce gave the orders to his crew to bring the cutter to a gliding halt and to ship their oars. Once that had been achieved, he stood, making sure of his footing in the centre of the boat before doing so. It would never do to seem unsteady in the face of this delegation.
"Please state your reasons for being here, monsieur."
That led to a repetition of all that had been said the night before, to a stony-faced crew who seemed determined not to respond. Finally, the black-coated fellow in the tall hat said, not without pomposity,
"The Revolution recognizes your flag of truce. Please step ashore."
The point at which he did so was tricky. It always was to a man's dignity when he first stepped on dry land after having been weeks at sea. Benign it might have been, but a ship was never steady, and a man's legs had to adjust to constant movement to keep his balance. That removed, it was difficult to cope with terra firma, and Pearce felt instinctively he had lost a point when one of the musket-bearing soldiers had to step forward and take his arm to steady him. Still feeling as if he was on moving ground, he introduced himself.
"Lieutenant John Pearce of His Britannic Majesty's Royal Navy, at your service." "Representative on mission from the Committee of Public Safety, Henri Raffin."
"Can I ask if I am speaking to the voice of authority in the town?" The reply was given with a pompous air, and Pearce suspected it was aimed at his companions as much as his visitor.
"There is no other authority than the Committee of Public Safety. You will accompany us, monsieur, to the Hôtel de Ville, where we will listen to what you have to say."
Pearce spun round and looked down into the boat.
"Michael, to me with the second flag."
O'Hagan reached down and pulled up a staff bearing another flag of truce, and without seeking permission, stepped out onto the quay to exchange a look first with Pearce, then a less agreeable one with the overdressed sod he had been talking to. "This member of my ship's company will attend on me." Raffin stroked his moustaches, and his expression was one of disdain, as if to say, "If you are not safe on your own, what good will one sailor do?" He did not understand what Pearce said. "Michael, anything goes wrong, you know which neck to wring first." Pearce then smiled at Raffin, who was unaware that a sentence of death had just been passed on him. "After you, monsieur." "Citizen," said Raffin, sharply correcting him. The route to the Hôtel de Ville took them round the harbour quays, past tables piled with fish and crustaceans, crabs and langoustines still moving, and Pearce noted that among the fishing boats there were armed vessels, which would serve either as slavers or privateers, as well as the usual knot of big fishing smacks not out that day. With an eye becoming increasingly more professional, he noted the number of guns on the larger vessels and their calibre, as well as trying to appreciate their possible sailing qualities, until he realized that not even the most experienced sailor could tell much regarding such things when a ship was tied up to a quay. When they reached the busy main quay facing the medieval towers, the power of the man leading them became all too evident, as the crowds going in both directions parted like the Red Sea before Moses, and those in his path took care not to catch his eye. In the open-fronted taverns dotted between the warehouses, the babble of noise from the customers abated for the same reason, fear of standing out in any way. Pearce had seen this before. The power of the revolution and its activities to cow the people, a revolution that was originally intended to free them. Yet it was also true that as they marched, they gathered a following, who became increasingly bellicose as their numbers swelled in another demonstration of that which Pearce had seen before, crowd courage replacing private caution. The whole town, when they left the quay, had a medieval air, every thoroughfare busy with carts, mixed with humans and animals carrying their produce. Flagged pavements, not dirt paths, lay under arched stone canopies, which would keep the more leisurely citizens of La Rochelle out of the sun and rain, giving the place an atmosphere of long-term wealth. This had been a major French commercial port for centuries, but sugar and the slave trade had probably made it doubly prosperous, which had Pearce wondering how many of its wealthy citizens had fallen victim to the type of man he was following. The guillotine stood in the centre of the square before the Hôtel de Ville, in stark contrast to the street market that lined the edges, full of stalls selling piled vegetables and fruit, meat, butchered and still living, chickens and rabbits in baskets. Clearly the place did not want for plentiful food from the surrounding countryside, as well as abundant fish from the sea. The engine of death, it was plain, had not been idle. There was the smell of blood as they came close, and the traces of human flesh around the place where a detached head would fall. The cobbles beneath that point were stained for yards, and Pearce knew why, because he had seen the fountain of red mist that erupted from the neck of a victim as the blade struck through. He had to close his eyes for a moment, and he staggered slightly on one of those cobbles, only to be held by Michael's strong hand. "Steady, John boy," O'Hagan said. "Do not let memory dishearten you." "You guessed?" "Sure, John, and I am saying a prayer for your father's soul this very minute, though I would not want these heathens around us to overhear it." Steps led up to the raised area from which the mayors of the town had been wont to make announcements ever since it was built, and Pearce had a sudden notion of the longevity of the place. La Rochelle was certain to have been a Roman settlement. Perhaps there had been an oration platform here before, which now performed the same function for Raffin, a place from which to harangue the citizenry, as well as being the spot from which you could watch the imposition of what passed for justice. Inside the doors of the Hôtel de Ville the hallway was dark in comparison to the bright exterior sunlight, but there lay yet another reminder of the fate of his own father. A large table, with 3 long stripes of coloured cloth rising from floor to ceiling behind it, a copy of which he had seen in the conciergerie prison in Paris. The soldiers who had escorted them, without, it had to be said, much in the way of military bearing, dropped back and took up station as sentries. One was so much a civilian in uniform he immediately took out an onion and began to peel and eat it. The officers were different, better dressed, with more of a swagger about them, which had Pearce wondering what their rank had been in Bourbon times. With Raffin they arranged themselves along the back of the long table. This while Pearce, and Michael holding aloft the white flag behind him, heard, then saw the crowd of people who had been following come in to witness what was about to take place, their loud voices of condemnation echoing off the stone walls. The representative himself took centre stage in front of a high-backed chair, stood for a moment, and looked around him as if to underline his authority before he sat down, the rest of the committee, who had been waiting for him to do so, following suit, the crowd immediately silenced by the simple act of him raising his right hand.
"These fellows you wish to burden us with, Lieutenant, who are they?"
For the third time Pearce rattled off his story, knowing what he was engaged in was pure theatre. Raffin wanted to be seen to be consulting the citizens of the town by allowing them to hear what this interloper had to say. He would deliberate as if their opinion counted for something. But it was a farce. There was only one person to make a decision in La Rochelle, and the cockade in his hat, his black garments, and his wide tricolour sash were the badges of the authority to do that. If he ordered John Pearce and Michael O'Hagan out to face the guillotine, in total contravention of the laws of war, that too would be obeyed. Sailors from ports such as Lorient and Brest, he declined to mention Rochefort, it was too close, 5,000 in number.
"And why would you bring them here?"
The temptation to sigh, to let this bastard know that he had realized his game, had to be fought. The possible outcomes were too serious for him to indulge in the same measure of performance.
"The port has been taken over by the British fleet."
That had Raffin sitting forward, his face angry and shocked. This matched by what Pearce listened to behind him. Yet they must have heard of it by now. Hood's Marines had been ashore for a month.
"Traitors!"
Raffin spat.
"They will pay a heavy price."
That was another lure to be avoided, the desire to tell him not to count his chickens. "Then you will be pleased to know these are the officers and men who refuse to serve under the Bourbon flag."
"Citizens, then, not subjects!"
Raffin cried, his eyes producing a joyous look as that was taken up by his cheering audience.
"They wish to be landed on this coast. Lord Hood, who commands at Toulon, for now, Lord Hood agreed to release 4 of the major vessels to transport them to the Atlantic ports, where they could disembark and go back to their families." "Then why do you not take them to these ports, Lieutenant? La Rochelle is not a base for these kinds of ships."
"You will appreciate, monsieur."
"Citizen Raffin will do."
"You will appreciate, citizen, that while the British government has no desire to hold in Toulon such a quantity of sailors who refuse to serve, it also has no desire to immediately return them to a position from which they could act to threaten our own ships. The vessels are sound, and require only refitting with cannon, wood, water, and victuals to be fully ready for service."
"The first of which we cannot provide."
As Pearce nodded, Raffin looked over his shoulder and invited comments from the crowd.
The cry of, "Who is going to feed them?"
was the first to emerge from the overall clamour.
"The ships are well provisioned. The men coming ashore will be given access to their stores, and for the short period they are in the town, I doubt they will be a burden." 5,000 sailors!"
a voice shouted, only to be interrupted by John Pearce shouting even louder.
5,000 revolutionary sailors!
The military officer sitting next to Raffin leant forward and whispered in his ear, which had the representative nodding slowly. The crowd now observed a hushed silence, waiting for the outcome of the conversation.
"It has been put to me," Raffin said finally, "by General Westermann here, that a fighting sailor is only a seagoing soldier. He has suggested these men could serve to help in the trouble we have to contain the pestilence of the Vendée renegades."
That brought forth a loud and rippling murmur, but it was hard to tell if it was positive or negative.
"What about the ship, citizen?"
called another voice, posing the question Pearce dreaded.
"They will be left at anchor here, but stripped of the means to sail," he replied.
The same voice called out,
"The anchorage is not safe."
"You may sail them to Rochefort, which is close by, or perhaps the admiral commanding there will send a storeship and cruise. Whatever, my ship will be well on its way and safe from any retaliation. I do not think my flag of truce has any validity at sea."
"How we doing, John boy?"
asked Michael, as Raffin and his general had another whispered discussion.
"'Cause I don't see how we can get to that bugger behind the table if we's in trouble."
"I don't know, my friend. I think it is in the balance." Raffin stopped whispering and looked at Pearce for what seemed an age, building up the tension before he made his decision.
"General Westermann cares nothing for your charges. You cannot fight the renegades in the marshes of the Vendée with ships. You may do with them what you wish. My soldiers will escort you back to your boat, and you may tell your commanding officer that the sailors can be landed from noon."
"Thank you."
"Common seamen first, officers last."
Having no idea why Raffin had said that, Pearce just nodded. A couple of scruffy and disinterested National Guardsmen escorted Pearce and Michael back to their boat. Again Pearce looked at the shipping, noticing that a pair of the best-equipped vessels were now full of men, carrying out tasks that were commensurate with getting their vessels to sea. The decks were alive with crewmen, and the rigging was full of men lashing on spars and sails, in total contrast to the way they had been moribund when he had come ashore.
"Michael, you need a piss." "I do?"
"In the harbour. And take your time." Without another question, O'Hagan peeled off to the edge of the quay, in a way that had the most alert of their escorts twitching his musket. But seeing him undo the flap on his ducks and turning his back, the fellow just grinned, stopped and waited, indicating to his companion to do likewise. While Michael did a passable job of taking his time, Pearce was counting guns and the numbers of men, information which would be of great interest to Henry Digby. The procession of dozens of boats, some from the ships themselves, others from the port, went back and forth all day, taking out batches of sailors, with Digby, watching from his own quarterdeck, once more blessing the weather, for though there was a swell, there were no breakers to make the task of entering the harbour difficult. With each boat went the ship's stores, some to feed the sailors, other articles demanded by the soldiers to supply an army that seemed to lack most of the necessities of campaigning, despite the profusion of food that Pearce had seen that morning.
"We shall be away from here tomorrow, Mr. Pearce, with luck. Have you made the necessary preparations for the last act?"
"I have, sir, though I thought it too obvious to fetch them on deck. They can be seen from the higher elevation of the larger ships." The incendiary devices were down below, canvas pouches filled with tow and a charge of powder, which would be soaked in turpentine, then set alight, the falls from the sails laying across them. Nothing went up like dry tarred rope, and soon the rigging would be well alight. The flames would have to work harder with the wood, but the deck was dry, as were the inner bulwarks, so Digby reckoned them to be ablaze quickly, and as he pointed out to Pearce, nothing consumed a vessel like fire.
"Thank the Lord we stripped most of their powder out at Toulon. I would not want to be near 4 capital ships when their magazines went up."
"The General Westermann I mentioned has demanded what remains of that be carried ashore."
"He is welcome to it, Mr. Pearce. It is little enough."
"I spoke with some of the local boatmen, sir, when I took in the first draft. They are not all rabid Jacobins, and I have been told about this revolt these soldiers are fighting."
"And?"
asked Digby, with a clear indication that it had nothing to do with him.
"It seems a bloody affair with no quarter being given on either side." "You sound as if you regret that, Mr. Pearce. The French are our enemies, so let them reduce their numbers by all means possible."
"I do believe those fighting in the marshes to the north are as one with the men of Toulon." I sense sympathy, do I not? I think these sailors we are putting ashore will soon be put against them.
It is all very well such people saying they wish to restore a king to his throne and the Papist Church to its stolen property. But how much nuisance have we suffered from French kings and a clergy rich enough to subsidize their warlike ambitions?
Digby had not heard, as Pearce had, the boatmen's tales of villages burnt, women ravished before being disembowelled, babies skewered on bayonets, men tortured over roaring fires. There was another side, of course, for those same sources had told him that no soldier of the Revolution was safe from retribution. Many had been caught and treated in a like fashion, and the conflict had descended into a contest in butchery. The addition of so many men might just tip the balance against the rebellion, but when he made that point, Digby dismissed it.
Most of them will run, Mr. Pearce, for a French tar is no different to his British counterpart in that article. Devious, quick to take a chance, adept at avoiding detection. I doubt your General Westerman will still command a fifth of those he expects to have before a day or two is out.
"Attention, Mariette!" called a voice from a boat, which had all aboard aware of where it came from. Not one of the men they had escorted would ever refer to the ship by anything other than its French name. Pearce went to the side to hear an invitation from Moreau that he, Digby, and Mr. Lutyens should come to dine that night with the officers of the French squadron, who would be going at last light.
Perhaps they mean to take us hostage, Mr. Pearce.
Not with Mr. Neame manning our guns. I've told you, sir, he knows very well how to employ them. All the French officers, to the number of a dozen, had donned their best uniforms for the occasion, and the main cabin of Apollon, albeit that its stern lights were boarded over, had been cleared to set up a decent table. As they ate and drank, Pearce was left to wonder how they had managed to save such provisions and wines. But it transpired they had bought most of what was being consumed from the citizens of Algeciras, and it was now time to see off the last of that provender. It could not be called a jolly affair, but if you excused the glutton forcé, it was polite. Most of those present had been sous officers in the old Royal Navy, their increase in rank coming from the decimation of that service by the flight of émigré senior officers. So they knew their manners, and the subject of what would happen to the ships was not discussed until Moreau was seeing them over the side, his words addressed to Pearce. "It is not something I wish to admit, but positions reversed, I would be bound to follow the same course."
"Would it help, Captain Moreau, if I were to say there is not a man aboard HMS Pharaon who is looking forward to what must be done?"
"Surely you mean Mariette, my friend," said Moreau with a grin. But it was an expression which came and went quickly as he patted his own bulwark. "We have a sentiment about ships, do we not? Foolish. We would see them blown to pieces in battle, yet to surrender them—"
"You will be ashore in an hour, monsieur," Pearce replied, to cover Moreau's sad thoughts. They kept to their best uniforms for the journey to the shore, with Pearce in the prow of the boat, his flag of truce prominent. Raffin was there waiting with his military friends and his escort of musket-bearing, ill-disciplined National Guards, their bayonets glinting in the light of the sinking sun. He landed first and stood aside to let the others come ashore, introducing each one as he did so. Once they were all landed, and as Pearce moved to say a last farewell, Raffin barked out an order.
"Seize them!"
The officers were suddenly surrounded by sharp and pointed bayonets, in what must have been a prearranged instruction. Raffin's pallid face was alight with fury, and he spat saliva through those drooping moustaches as he cursed them.
"Traitors! Scum! Cowards! Do you think we do not know what you did? You surrendered your ships to the enemy. You have no honour, and if I have my way you will soon have no heads to trouble you with notions of it."
Pearce saw then, standing close by, a knot of French sailors, and he guessed that they were the men who had tried to take the vessels off Marseille. They had come ashore and denounced the 4 captains and their 8 lieutenants, which in the France of the likes of Raffin was as good as a death sentence.
"Monsieur, I protest!"
Pearce yelled over the cries of the same complaint from those arrested.
"These men are your supporters!"
"Citizen!" screamed Raffin,
in a voice that must have been heard on the other side of the harbour. "These men did their duty." "Well, they did not. They are rats, only they stayed aboard their ship instead of deserting them. Well, they are now going to the Hôtel de Ville, and tomorrow they will face me and my court of revolutionary justice. Let us hear them try and explain how they chose to surrender rather than die. Chose to help you take back their ships when they should have been prepared to see them sunk." 5,000 men would have drowned. Raffin was in a passion, spitting venom in near incoherence. "What does the revolution care if 5,000 die or 50,000? The world must be changed. Traitors like these cannot be left to think they can indulge in betrayal and live. Like the swine of Versailles and the scum who bled the poor, they will see what justice is." "Citizen, I am begging you." Raffin suddenly laughed. "I have a notion to respect your truce flag for one more day, monsieur. Perhaps you would like to come ashore again tomorrow and witness the way Madame Guillotine deals with traitors." Chapter 20. "Mr. Pearce, we cannot interfere in these matters. Much as I have sympathy for the officers we dined with this afternoon, they are no longer our responsibility, and I am forced to remind you of what you told me regarding those vessels preparing for sea. We may very well outgun them. However, they are numerous, and we are not." Henry Digby must have been well aware he was fighting a losing battle. It was not only Pearce who profoundly disagreed with him, but also Lutyens and Neame, though their protest was silent. The former said nothing, merely fixing his superior with a pained eye, and the latter was looking at the deck planking of his cabin in an attitude which indicated deep sorrow. "Besides, I would remind you of our need to get away from this shore as soon as possible. This weather cannot last." "The men threatened our innocence, sir, you know that. Their death will be for the purpose of a gesture to satisfy the bloodlust of that sod Raffin." So I think it behoves us to make some kind of gesture in response." "For instance?" "Mr. Neame," said Pearce. The old master lifted his head slowly and looked at his captain, the reluctance to actually speak obvious. But Digby was looking at him in a way that brooked a response, so after a long hiatus it came. "When we first anchored, sir, them French warships each had over 1,500 souls aboard." "I am aware of that, Mr. Neame." "Well, if you had placed a mark on our waterline before they was shipped ashore, you would see clear how much they had risen in the water." The first glimmer of what was coming appeared on Digby's face, but he had the good grace to let Neame make his point. "And since they was cleared of cannon and shot at Toulon, and the crew took ashore what stores she carried, I reckon that her draft is nothing like as much as it would be for a normal 74 in full commission. I would suggest they would need ballast before setting sail, for they are as high-floating as a ship laid up in ordinary off Chatham Dockyard. If the soundings I have for the entrance to La Rochelle are accurate, then there's enough to sail them in or close to on high tide. It'd be touch and go whether they'd actually make the harbour." There was no need to say the tide would begin to rise a couple of hours before dawn and peak late morning, or that the rise and fall in Biscay was telling, especially at this time of year, some 20 feet, with a concomitant strong inflow towards the shore. "Girth, Mr. Neame. I doubt a 74 would make it through those twin towers. What beam are we looking at, 50 feet? "It would be a scrape and no error, but they might. See, sir, the French build their ships a mite narrower than we do in England. If you have ever been aboard a capture, say like the old Magnamine, like I was as a lad, you will see it has had to be strengthened for the kind of service we put our vessels to, Atlantic gales, Channel storms, and the like. Sure, they're swift sailors, but they're not as seaworthy in a blow as ourn, because of that slim construction." "You think one might actually get through?" "Apollon is the most likely, sir. I've had a look at a beam, and it is of the margin of some 45 foot, so she might just shave those towers. Worst that could happen is she would stick, which would render the port unusable." "This is all very well, but that still does not give us any hope of interfering in the execution of—" Digby paused then, not knowing what to call them. They were no longer their charges. It was Lutyens who filled in for him. "Our friends, sir?" The reply was quite brusque. "Are they, Mr. Lutyens? I cannot see that drunkard Force as that." "I can see a delicious irony in the Revolution removing the head of somebody like Captain Jacqueline, given his own dogged loyalty to the cause. But several of those we dined with were men of good character." Pearce spoke next. "In other circumstances, sir, I would see myself becoming close to Moreau and Garnier. I would also, even on the short acquaintance I have now, consider it a desertion to leave them to their fate." "You are asking me to risk men's lives, and for all I know this ship, for men who are, even if we would have it otherwise, our enemies." "I am." Pearce was tempted to relate to Digby the sight and sound of a revolutionary decapitation. The square en fête, as though the death of some innocent soul was a cause for celebration. Flags waving, crowds cheering, the occasional sight of unbridled licentiousness. The traders seeking to profit from it, selling food and trinkets, such as cockades made of dyed human hair from previous victims, model guillotines which children could take home to try out on a rat, or if they were as debased as some of their parents, on a household pet. The knock that disturbed his thoughts, as well as the entry, was peremptory, with Harbin's freckled face suddenly lit by the cabin lanterns. "Boats coming alongside, sir, quiet-like, and calling out the ship's old French name when challenged." John Pearce was out of the cabin and onto the deck first, to find the men on watch standing by their loaded cannon, looking towards the low glow of gas lighting from the centre of La Rochelle. On a night with a lot of cloud cover, so no moon or stars, those ashore could not be trusted to stay put, and Digby had set a watch to cover all eventualities. Barring his own cabin bulkheads, the ship was cleared for action, with deadlights shipped over the stern casements, every gun on both sides of the deck loaded with canister and run out, boarding nets rigged, and men in the mainmast cap bearing primed and loaded muskets. "Mariette!" a voice called softly, and Pearce replied just as quietly, asking them to approach into the pool of light cast by the ship's lanterns. They were not stupid, these men in the boat. Aware there must be a lookout ashore keeping an eye on this sloop, they rowed round to the weather side and came close, hidden by the ship's bulk. Another call from Pearce had them come alongside, with Digby issuing a sharp command to look lively, in case it was some kind of trap. This while his premier carried on a conversation with someone in the boat, quiet words that to everyone else were nothing but murmurings. "Get him aboard, Mr. Pearce," hissed Digby. "He won't come aboard, sir, but what he has to say is interesting." "Interesting to you?" Digby growled in a rare show of frustration. Pearce let that go, instead resuming his conversation with the man bobbing up and down in the boat, which included the passing over of a piece of paper. Asked to wait, Pearce took that to Digby to show him. "Who are they?" "Men from Apollon and Patriote, sir, though they will give no names." "We have no guarantee they came here without being seen." "They did not come out from the port, and they have told me of a part of the town wall on the south quadrant, so much in disrepair it has fallen down." "Guards?" Digby asked, before adding, "Not that I'm taken with any notion of going near it." "There is a sentry detail there, but our man tells me that they are slack." Sensing that his captain remained unconvinced, Pearce went on, "I have seen the calibre of the local National Guard, sir, and they are slovenly in the extreme, with weapons that are so ill-maintained I wonder if they could fire, let alone with any accuracy." "They don't have to be accurate, Mr. Pearce. They merely need to make a noise to raise a screaming mob." "And if they are taken care of in such a way they cannot fire their weapons?" "Is that what they are promising?" "Only that, and I admire the honesty. They will help us to the breach in the wall and point out the guard detail. Then it is up to us." "And what would that be?" "They cannot do anything close to the town centre, and especially the Hôtel de Ville. The danger of recognition is too great, and while they have a wish to see freed the men due to be condemned, they have no notion to take their place." Timings? We must go with them now, allow them to get us into La Rochelle so we can be in a position to effect a rescue at around dawn. The Revolutionary Tribunal will not meet that early, very likely not till near 10 of the clock, and the prisoners are incarcerated in a set of cells under the Hôtel de Ville. And how will you get away? The harbour is full of boats, and the walls are well equipped with cannon. Perhaps you, sir, standing in, could distract them, and Mr. Neam's notion might serve as well. It seems to me you are bent on this. That was the first crack in Digby's inclination to do nothing, and John Pearce exploited it immediately. I would only go ashore with men who had volunteered, and I would not dream of including anyone you deemed necessary to the safety of the ship. Digby began to pace, Pearce joining him with an anxious look over his shoulder, lest the boatman from La Rochelle depart. He was anxious to speak to them once more, to add to their plan an idea of his own. How many men? Half a dozen. One of the mids, if they wish, and me in command. At least if I suffer, there will be no real loss to the King's navy. You seem to have a wish to continually risk your life, Mr. Pearce. I thought, sir, that was a prerequisite for the role of a commissioned officer. Responsibility is another, sir. There was no doubting the tone of that. Digby was suffering a degree of pique. Not that he would necessarily go himself on such a hare-brained adventure. The fact that he did not have the choice is what rankled, the needs of his command coming first. Make your arrangements with the fellows in the boat, then come to the cabin and see if we can concoct some plan to aid you with the help of Mr. Neam and Mr. Sykes. Michael O'Hagan, volunteering, once the case was explained to him, left little room for Rufus and Charlie to decline. Martin Dent was there in a flash, and he chided Dysart into putting himself forward by alluding to their previous adventures ashore. Costello, being of dark skin and hair colour, was more of an asset, Dysart being fair. Needless to say, Midshipman Harbin was all for it. "Mr. Harbin," said Pearce, "I appreciate your zeal, and I know that having you along would be a plus. Yet I would not want to deny Mr. Fairmeadow the possibility of action which I think might improve his own opinion of himself." The tall youngster looked at him with a steady gaze, as Pearce added, "It will not reflect badly on you, Mr. Fairmeadow, if you decline. There will be no record of it." "Except in my memory, sir." "Then let me once more outline the risks, for I would not want you along just for the sake of your pride. We are going ashore to a town that is in the hands of some of the bloodiest scoundrels the world has ever known. Should we fail, we might get quarter, for our captain has undertaken to bombard the port if any harm should come to us. But there is no guarantee we will not be treated as spies." "And if we succeed?" "Then, Mr. Fairmeadow, you will be able to hold your own at any dinner you attend in your future as a naval officer, for there will be no one at that board who has partaken of an adventure to match this." "Then, sir, I would be grateful if you will include me in your party." "Then get those white breeches off," Pearce said, as the other midshipman's face collapsed, "and get into all dark clothes." "I am sorry, Mr. Harbin, I cannot take you both, but I would be obliged if you would command the boat that will take us ashore." Seeing the gleam that appeared in the boy's eye then, he insisted, producing in doing so another gloomy look, "And you will return to the ship as soon as you have enough light to see."
"Sorry my old bones will be of no use to you, Mr. Pearce," said Latimer. "Was a time I'd have been first at the gangway."
"I don't doubt it, old friend." Blubber Booth cut in, "And I won't volunteer for fear of the sight of me trying to run." "You'll never make a topman, Blubber, that's for certain." Pearce turned to the rest of the party assembled on the deck, those who had already put themselves forward. Behind him he heard Latimer whisper to Blubber.
"D'ye hear what he called me? Old friend," he said. "That's the sign of a right gent."
"Mr. Sykes, wish us luck." "Goes without saying, sir, and I hope Mr. Neam and I can do our part. Just make sure, Sykes, that you do not leave yourselves exposed by delaying too long." "I often thought about fishing you out of the water off Deal, your honour, whether it were right or wrong." Pearce had been swimming ashore with the shingle of Deal Beach in sight, seeking to desert, when a strong hand had grabbed him and hauled him into the boat. Sykes had been on the end of that hand, and this was the first time since it had been mentioned.
"I reckon you would have been seen by the officer of the watch."
"As an attempt to get free, it was not the wisest. You felt it was right at the time, Mr. Sykes, and that will do me."
"You might have got clean away."
"You didn't believe that, did you?"
"No. Even if you had not been spotted, you were new-pressed, with no idea of how to avoid the Deal crimps, of which there are any number. God rot them. Barclay would have had you flogged as soon as you were dragged back aboard."
"Then I should probably thank you." Sykes grinned.
"That would be gilding it, Mr. Pearce."
The boat with the party of Frenchmen had stood off, sitting outside the lights of the ship, and were invisible from the deck until John Pearce and his party cast off. A voice called to them, and a single spark was struck from a set of flints to locate them, Pearce ordering his oarsmen to get them close. Once done, the Frenchman tossed over a thin line, not to tow them in any way, but to ensure that in the pitch darkness they would stay in contact. There was the slightest trace of phosphorescence from the striking oars, but not enough to be seen from more than a few yards away. Judging by the way the waves were hitting the bow, HMS Pharaon's boat was being led out to sea, and at one time the bulk of one of the French warships slid by their rowlocks, clearly being used as a mark by their guides, who then turned in towards the shore. The pace was steady, designed for minimum noise, not maximum speed, and with the run of the sea on the quarter, the cutter was rocking back and forth until another turn had it lifting and dropping the thwarts.
"Water's shelving,"
Costello called quietly from the bow, the truth of that evident as the lead rope went slack and the keel hit soft sand. Another flint strike came through the gloom, and Pearce pointed, before realizing that no one could see it. "Get ashore and gather by that spark and wait till you have your feet. Mr. Harbin, stand off until first light. If we fail at the breach, it is to you we will be running for succour." Some had to kneel in the sand for several minutes before they felt safe to stand, with Pearce demanding patience from their nervous escorts. But eventually the volunteers were steady enough to be led off the beach onto a path that took them through a forest of pines. That was narrow and ended well away from the town wall, the same battlements that had once withstood the efforts of Richelieu and his Catholic army. They had been a formidable obstacle then, but time and advancements in artillery had made them useless, so the burghers of the time saw no point in spending money on repairs.
"Où est les sentinelles?"
asked Pearce, the reply sending him towards a windowless hut from which came the faint glow of a smouldering fire. The next thing that came was snores, and edging close and looking through the gap that covered the place where the walls had collapsed, he could just make out 3 recumbent bodies, one in a chair with his musket across his lap, so obviously the sentry on duty, the other 2 stretched out in proper sleep on a pair of cots. He crept round to the back, finding the door and establishing with the slightest of creaks that it was not locked on the inside. Then he went back to where his party was waiting, near invisible shapes silhouetted against La Rochelle. "Mr. Fairmelot, Michael, Martin, there are 3 fellows in there, all asleep." He outlined how they lay to right and left of the door, then added, "1 each, but render them captured. No killing." The gleam of Fairmelot's dirk also picked up a little of the gaslight from the town, and Pearce would have liked to have seen the boy's face. Was it determined or fearful? It mattered not, as long as he did what was asked. As the trio went to carry out his orders, he thanked the Frenchman who had brought them this far, and issued them an invitation to go back from whence they had come and join Mr. Harbin, pointing out that they would be welcome aboard HMS Pharaon. For that he was thanked, but they declined. They had to get back to the Place de la Révolution. The muffled grunts from the hut told him his orders in that quarter were being obeyed, and soon Michael was by his side confirming it. "Strip them, then tie them up, and I need to know when they are due to be relieved. Perhaps if Mr. Fairmelot was to play with his dirk we might find out." When he heard what Fairmelot had done with his weapon, Pearce laughed. There was nothing a man would not tell you if you threatened to remove from him his manhood with an instrument that was less than truly sharp. The 3 replacements came with the dawn, under the command of a fellow slightly more martial in his attire, probably a sergeant. Neither his rank nor his well-maintained uniform and more military bearing saved him from capture, and he too ended up in the nearby woods, lashed in his smalls to a tree, with a gag in his mouth, able to look at the half-dozen of his men in similar straits. "Pick the uniform coat that is closest to your size and get it on." "Holy Mother of Christ! Are they old dwarfs in the place?" cried Michael, struggling into a coat several sizes too small. Then he picked up the musket. 42 inches in length, he managed to make it look like a toy, while the whole ensemble, including his hat, made him look like something out of a Rari show that was designed to lampoon the French nation. "I'll not try the boots, John boy, for as sure as hell is hot they will cripple me." It was only when the light came up strong enough that the party was reminded that one of their number was still dressed in his proper uniform. Lieutenant John Pearce unwrapped from his waist the truce flag he had brought with him, and using his sword, cut off a sapling with which to carry it. He then addressed his party. "You are my escort. I have been invited to come ashore and witness the activities of the Revolutionary Tribunal, which I fully intend to do. So, Mr. Fairmelot, having taken the sergeant's coat, I ask you to form up the escort ahead of and behind me, and take me to the proposed place of execution." The same grey dawn saw Neame and Sykes, with a small party of sailors, aboard Apollon, with the master blessing the slight onshore breeze drawn in by the heat of the land. Rigging a scrap of canvas was all they could do, but if the breeze held, it would serve. The problem was also compounded by that breeze, for once in motion with so few men aboard, it would be near impossible to take the way off the ship. If forced to abort what was planned, the only option was to seek to steer her into the shallow northern bay and run it aground. Harbin had rejoined him in the cutter, only be told to step a mast and head out to sea to act as a guard boat for the possible sight of a French ship from Rochefort. Digby had calculated the time taken to send a horse-borne message to the admiral there, then added the time needed to act upon it. The port was miles upriver, but there would be some kind of picket boat at the mouth of the estuary, which meant that it was very possible their departure, or their course to clear Oleron, could be impeded. In fact, as he walked his deck, just as it was finished being swabbed and flogged dry, he was cursing himself for agreeing to let Pearce and his party go ashore, and wondering, if his worst fears were realized, if he might be forced to abandon them. Chapter 21. The streets were full of the same bustle, and the quay resounded with calls as the locals bargained for the first and best of the morning catch. Pearce and his untidy escort made their way by the noise of their boots, which cleared a path by the mere crack of metal studs on cobbles. Though many a glance was thrown at the British naval officer carrying that truce flag, very few of them were hateful, leading Pearce to speculate again on the difference between the mass of Frenchmen and those at the forefront of radical change. But it was only an occasional distraction. Most of his thoughts were taken up with what he had to do next, which was no easy matter, since he had only a very sketchy idea of what he was about to face, from the information hurriedly imparted by the men who had come out to HMS Pharaon in their boat. The National Guard was not numerous, some 100 souls, of which a third would be on duty at any one time. Soldiers should not be a problem. They were encamped to the north of the town, facing any threat that might come from the Chouan rebels, which made him wonder. Their commander and several of his officers seemed more content to enjoy the ease of a proper bed in La Rochelle than shared the discomfort of their military encampment. The number of carts and load-bearing peasants in the streets forced the party to use the covered walkways, which, while it scattered those wishing to share the pavements, had the benefit of severely reducing the possibility of their men with him being recognized by their French opposite numbers. After all, these were some of the same fellows who had gone aboard Apollon off Marseille, and the disguise they had was far from comprehensive. A forced crossing on the main thoroughfare took them to the Place de la Révolution, and to a packed square in which traders had already set out their stalls to sell their wares. Pearce looked anxiously over their heads to what, in his mind, had become the oration platform, glad to see that it was empty. No sign of Raffin, who probably would not stir for a time yet. In forcing a passage to the Hôtel de Ville, he noticed that most of the assembled crowd were the sailors he had helped to land the day before, and his presence set up a murmur that he could not identify. It was anger, but at whom was it directed? It seemed to him that a great deal of the looks he was getting was supplicant, not irate. They were being aimed, unfairly as it happened, at his supposed file of National Guards. It was a good thing they could not speak the Erse, a tongue in which Michael was roundly cursing those who blocked his path. The sketch the unnamed boatman had given him told him the entrance to the prison was inside the main building, a set of steps leading up from the basement cells to the main hall and the long desk at which sat the Revolutionary Tribunal. As a point of entry, it was a choice of last resort. If possible, he did not wish to go into the confines of the Hôtel de Ville, because inside he would be bound to be outnumbered, and if his lot came face to face with anyone in the same uniform, it would only be a second before the fact they were impostors was announced. There was a sunken gate on the southern side of the building, in an alleyway only wide enough for one cart, down a set of steep steps. It was the way in which food, wood, and water were taken in, and the waste they produced removed, while it was also, no doubt, the exit by which any cadaver of a prisoner who had expired would be extracted. It would be guarded on the inside, and he racked his brain to find a way of getting in. "Michael, I need to exchange hats and coats. Stand well back at street level while I go to the bottom of the steps and knock. I want that British uniform to be visible." Pearce was not small, but the time it took for Michael to get into his coat was annoying, and there was no way the arms would reach his wrists, nor would the lapels come close enough together to look proper, so he was ordered to hand the garments over to Fermelot, who looked more the part of a British naval officer. His instructions were to stand sideways as Pearce went to the base of the damp steps, which smelt of the corruption caused by human beings, and the wind-blown filth that filled the foot of the well. He took out, loaded, and cocked his pistol, and balancing on a loose section of the lowest step, which rocked slightly, he banged loudly on the studded oak door. The voice that replied took several seconds, and was querulous, which probably meant the fellow had been snoozing. Standing well to the side as the grill-covered viewing panel was slid back so the fellow inside could see Fermelot, surrounded by a file of National Guards, Pearce lowered his voice an octave and growled that he had been ordered to bring in the English officer. The response was a protest, but the mention of Citizen Raffin and the information it was his personal order proved enough to get the keys rattling and the door unlocked. As it swung open, Pearce barreled through and had the pistol under the warder's chin in a second, grunting in French for him to back away and get down on his knees, an order the lanky fellow obeyed swiftly, with a sob that he be allowed to live. The rest of Pearce's party were quickly through the door, only to be faced at the end of a 20-foot corridor with another nail-studded door locked on the inside, which served as a doubly secure means of ensuring those taken into prison stayed there. A demand to the warder for the key brought a negative response, plus the information it could only be opened from the inside. And it was obvious the only person those on the other side of the door would respond to was now on his knees, trembling before the waving pistol of John Pearce. "Hear noises," said Martin Dent, who had his ear pressed to one of the points where the ancient oak door failed to meet the jamb, places at which, over the years, it had shrunk. "Voices, keys rattling, bit of shouting." Pearce edged him aside and listened himself, harbouring a deep feeling of despair as he heard what sounded like the movement of several protesting prisoners. Were they moving them earlier than he had hoped? He needed to get through the door now, but if he did, he would be in the narrow confines of a prison, probably against greater odds, and while he accepted that every man with him faced the same risk as he felt forced to hesitate, being reluctant to commit them when he had no idea of what they faced.
"Michael, get that bastard on his feet."
The Irishman literally lifted him bodily, for although a tall fellow there was no weight to him, and for good measure he slammed him painfully against the rough stonework of the wall, producing a cry.
"One good blow, Michael, to let him know what he faces if he does not help us."
The prominent nose went in an instant, sending forth a fountain of blood, and dropping the warder back onto his knees, his hands over his smashed snout. Pearce, leaning over him, had not enjoyed that. Much as he hated prison warders, and much as in the past he had experienced their rapacity and total lack of empathy for anyone who could not bribe them for comforts, it went against his personal grain to indulge in torture. But he suspected that if he did not, the French officers would die. In the balance of things, this fellow's pain meant little. Harsh words and threats had the man look up at him, and the pistol waving before his bleeding nose. "You will go to the door. You will knock and use whatever password is agreed to get us through, or you will die, not by this pistol, but at the hands of my friend here, who will tear you to shreds bit by painful bit." Odd that Michael did not speak a word of French, yet he must have sensed what Pearce was about, because he grabbed the fellow by the neck of his rough smock, rocked him back and forth against the wall, causing the warder to scream in fear and pain, which was a snuffling affair, coming as it did through the blood he was swallowing. Michael, on command, lifted him again, and shoved him towards the door, one hand, when he got there, tightly gripping the fellow's gonads.
"Tell him, John boy, that if he messes us around, I will rip off his balls."
The knock that followed was clearly a signal, 2 raps at a time, with a gap in between a trio of the same, but there was no response. The small panel in the top did not open. No voice answered, and Pearce, with his ear to the gap at the edge, heard no sound where there had been much before. Ordered to knock again, encouraged by an extra squeeze from Michael, the warder repeated the coded request. Still no response. Pearce stood back, looking around him for something to force open the door. His eyes alighted on a set of stout fire-irons by a grate, at this time of year out of use. Then he looked at the door again, with hinges and locks not visible, being on the inside, and the gap all round, which might provide leverage.
"Michael, get the poker and jemmy that door open."
Michael went to stick it into the lock side, only to be stopped by Pearce.
"The hinge side, Michael. That is the weakest point on a door."
"And how would you know that, John Pearce?"
asked Charlie Taverner. Pearce grinned, though he was still anxious.
"If you get mixed up with the wrong people, Charlie, even if you don't want to, they tell you things like this." "Sounds to me like you've seen the inside of a place like this afore, sir," added Dysart.
"He's one of us," crowed Martin Dent with a laugh. "A felon by nature, don't you know that?"
Costello responded in a shocked voice.
"How has you missed the grading boy talking to an officer in that manner?"
"Too fly, Costello, that's why. And I'm Mr. Fairmelow."
The young mid just blushed as Pearce gave an impatient signal for silence.
"Jam it in as far as you can, Michael, a foot from the top and the bottom. That is where the hinges will be, and if they are rusted they will give."
Doing that, it was clear, even with his great weight and strength, when he bent to the task of heaving, it was not enough.
"Martin, Dysart, Costello, on one side and pull. Charlie, Rufus, push with Michael.
Mr. Fairmelow," he added, pointing to the warder now crouching against the wall, again holding his face,
"put your bayonet by that bastard's throat."
Heave as they might, it was to little effect, and Pearce realized they needed something with which to hammer the metal point further in.
"Part of the bottom step leading to the street is loose. Someone fetch it. Use the other fire-irons to dislodge it. The rest, get your bayonets into the gap and see if you can enlarge it." "Noise, John boy."
"What choice, Michael?" The Irishman shrugged. There was none. Odd, then, that on the 4th blow with the granite of the bottom step, the sound of a key came through the wood, and in a second the door swung open. A ruddy-faced fellow came through, and seeing a group of National Guards in various stages of dress and undress, demanded what in the name of creation was going on. So much for security, as the one in the sergeant's uniform coat put his pistol to the man's chest, and O'Hagan, in nothing more than his shirt, swung a blow that knocked the bugger right off his feet.
"You weren't hoping to talk to him, John boy, were you?"
"If I was, there's no point now.
Get the keys."
Through the door they entered another corridor with cells off to one side. The interior of those stone-lined chambers showed evidence of recent occupation. Unconsumed food and the open ditty-bags and sea-chests containing the possessions the French officers had brought ashore. Keys in hand, Pearce made his way to the end, ordering that the 2 warders should be gagged and shoved in a cell. There was yet another door, and when he put his ear to the join, Pearce could feel a slight cold draught on his cheek. Slowly he inserted each of a dozen keys, easing each one round till it stopped, until he found the right one, which went through the well-oiled levers. Indicating that his men should be quiet, he eased open the door, to be faced with another set of stone steps leading up to a beamed ceiling. From where he stood he could see the back of the top half of a National Guard, and he could hear voices, or to be more precise, one voice, that of Raffin, vilifying his prisoners, heaping every insult in the revolutionary vocabulary on their heads. He tried to imagine those being harangued, hoping most of them were looking at their accuser with defiance. Another voice protested, which Pearce recognized as that of Jacquelin, pleading he was no traitor but a true son of the Revolution. At least Raffin stopped to listen to him, as the captain of the Orion cried out the tale of resistance in Toulon, how he had led his men to refuse to serve, of his reluctance to surrender to the British at any time, and of how only those cowards who could not face the ultimate sacrifice demanded by the Revolution had stopped him from running his ship into Marseille regardless of the consequences. That was his undoing. Pearce had removed his hat and crawled silently up the steps to a point where, through the guard's legs, he could just see the long table at which Raffin sat. The representative on mission was sitting when Pearce first saw him, playing with his moustaches again, a look of contempt on his face as he listened to Jacquelin. Ultimate sacrifice had him leaping to his feet, screaming and damning the man for the coward he had to be if he was not prepared to lead by example. The implication being that if Jacquelin had laid down his own life, others would have been inspired by his example. Not being able to see the accused was frustrating. A man who no doubt felt he had reasonable grounds to be freed. He did not know the beast with which he had been brought to grapple. Pearce could imagine him, though, the crushing truth getting through. Everything he had believed in was false. There was no liberté, égalité, fraternité, and certainly no justice. Raffin calmed himself and began to speak in a mocking tone, detailing the misdeeds of these men who had once served King Louis. How could any decent citizen be sure of their motives? Had they not come from Toulon as agents of those traitors in that port to undermine the revolution in another, and used the desire of the true people of France, the men they led, as an excuse to betray? He then went into a flowery peroration, detailing with little modesty his own credentials as a man who had suffered under the monarchy, though in truth it did not sound to Pearce like much in the way of discomfort. The audience, there must be one or no speech was necessary, listened in silence to a catalogue of self-aggrandizement. Finally Raffin delivered the damning words, his voice rising as he spoke. As a true son of the Revolution, I demand that these traitors pay the penalty of any man who holds up his hand to stop the progress of the people. I demand they face the guillotine. Those watching, who had not dared to utter more than a murmur during the proceedings, broke into loud cheering. They had come for blood, and they were going to get it. There was then a farce, while Raffin consulted the other tribunal members, half a dozen army officers, General Westerman first, his inferiors in order of rank, all of whom merely said guilty, a verdict that had only one sentence. "Take them to the place of execution," Raffin shouted. "Now!" The sentry in front of Pearce moved, and so did he, sliding back down the stairs to join his waiting men. He and Fairmellow exchanged coats again, and Dysart, who had never left hold of the truce flag he had brought from the ship, raised it to indicate he still had it, and Pearce took it from him. "I will go up first. If I signal with my thumb behind my back, follow me up. If I show you one pointed finger, shut and lock this door and run." The incongruity of having a flag of truce in one hand, a sword in the other, and his pistol in his belt was not lost on Pearce as he ascended the steps, this time going on until he could see the chamber was now empty, though he could hear the cheering from the square in front. Quickly he indicated that his companions should join him, and as soon as they did, he moved past the tribunal table to a point where he could see out of the open double doors which led to the elevated plinth. Raffin was there, facing the square in his black coat, big hat, and tricolour sash, no doubt flanked by his fellow judges, and he had his hands raised, calling for silence, an instruction the crowd were unwilling to obey. "Right. We go out through those double doors and arrest Raffin and his companions." "And then?" demanded Charlie, who obviously had reservations about what would happen next. "We collect the prisoners, march them and that bastard in the black coat down to the harbour, take a boat and row back out to HMS Farron. And before you tell me it's madness, Charlie, let me say I agree with you. But I can think of no other way to save men who do not deserve to die." Charlie grinned, which lit up his face, and showed that look which must have been his main asset as he fleeced the unwary visitors to his part of London. It was a grin to get all your coins out of your purse. "Oh, as long as you know it's madness, that's all right." "Form up, lads," Pearce hissed. "Let's do this in regulation fashion." Rufus Dommett was shaking, and Pearce put a hand on his shoulder, addressing Charlie. "Look after him, won't you?" Charlie aimed a soft punch at the other's shoulder. "Never fear, John. No pelican will go down if I have a say in it." "I'll be sound, Pearce, I promise," said Rufus. "I know you will, Rufus." As soon as Raffin started shouting out his message to the mob, they silently approached the open doors. Not that noise mattered. The roaring voice covered their footsteps, and only those at the very far side of the square would be able to see them. Since they were in the local uniform, it created no alarm, at least until Pearce raised the flag of truce, which got folk pointing. When they levelled their muskets at the backs of those lined up slightly behind Raffin, the men to either side of him turned to look and froze. Pearce took Michael's musket and aimed over the shoulder of the representative on mission, who was still shouting out his slogans, though the pointing fingers and loud gestures from below should have told him there was something amiss. The crack of the musket ball whizzing by his ear did that in no uncertain terms, his body jerking in shock. That passing ball affected the crowd as well, as, aimed over their heads, it crossed the square to smack into the wall of a house, making everyone duck. "Stay absolutely still, monsieur." Pearce stepped forward and, pistol out once more, put it to Raffin's head, looking from the side into a face creased with shock. "Tell your guards by the guillotine to release the prisoners at once." Raffin's mouth was moving, but no sound emerged for several seconds. When it did come, he croaked, "You will die for this." "You will die too, rest assured. Now do as I ask, or are you prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for the revolution?" "You hear that, Mr. Sykes?" asked Neame. "I did. A shot. Faint, but as clear as day." "Then I say it is time to let go the anchors." The orders were passed below, and men with mallets attacked the bitts holding the anchor cables. The stern anchor had the strain on a rising tide, and as it released it started to run out through the hawse hole at such speed that those on deck could see smoke rising from the friction burn. The bower anchor went more slowly, in the process aiding Neame on the wheel to swing the bows until they were facing right towards the twin towers of La Rochelle. Creaking, Apollon began to drift, and a few more commands had the main course dropped, though it had no effect until those who had let it fall could get to the deck and sheet home on both sides. That done, they were ordered to the entry port to take the first of the boats back to HMS Pharaon. "Do you think," said Lutyens on the deck of that ship, "that is the signal Pearce intended?"
"God only knows, Mr. Lutyens, but by damn I hope so."
Pearce, even on such a short acquaintance, had surmised Raffin was a bully and a coward, and so it proved to be. The pistol at his temple reduced him to jelly, and he could hardly find the breath to issue orders to the other National Guardsmen to lay down their weapons and release the prisoners.
"Those weapons, Mr. Fairmelow," said Pearce, "and fetch our chargers up here."
"With me, Dommit," the boy said, and the two youngest members of the party went into a crowd which parted before them to secure the muskets, carrying them back to the podium in the wake of the French officers. Moreau was not grinning, he was grim as he asked how they were going to get from this crowded square to the port and a boat. Pearce pushed the pistol slightly, moving Raffin's head.
"Matters are in hand, but I would hazard that it might be a bad idea to leave these military officers to lead any resistance or pursuit."
Moreau picked up one of the weapons that Fairmelow had dropped at his feet, and walking up to General Westerman, he first threatened to bayonet him. That the man showed no fear was admirable. If he was going to die, he was prepared to do so while setting an example. Moreau reversed the weapon and hit him hard on the temple so that he collapsed like a sack of flour. With that as an example, the others arrested took on the remainder of the tribunal members until all were comatose and bleeding, lying on the stone, with Pascal Garnier having to restrain some of the younger men who would have beaten their victims to death. "And now, monsieur?" asked Moreau.
"Watch and follow me."
Pearce jabbed Raffin again.
"Look at the ground and keep your eyes there."
Pistol at Raffin's head, Pearce moved down the steps to a crowd that seemed too dense to negotiate. But part it did, as the sailors from the 4 French warships suddenly moved. They had taken up positions that morning as a collective notion to protest at the treatment of their innocent leaders, and created a path through which Pearce, Moreau, and the rest could proceed, closing behind them to foil anyone trying to interfere, some wishing their officers bon chance from behind hats that hid their faces. Fairmelow brought up the rear, walking backwards, musket at the ready, as the first of the cannon spoke from the sea wall and the towers of St. Nicholas and La Chaîne. Chapter 22. Few admirals would have sent a 74-gun ship into the arc of fire presented by the cannons of La Rochelle, but if they had decided the risk to be worthwhile, the vessels would have taken on the defences on the sea wall with their own blazing broadsides. No such option existed for Apollon, and if the French gunners knew they were firing at one of their own ships, it made no difference to their intent. Blasting away from a secure platform and at short range, the balls tore great chunks out of the warship, sending splinters flying all over the upper deck when they hit the bulwarks. Neame and Sykes ducked continually, and they could hear the wounding blows being taken under their feet as the gun ports they had opened earlier, in a bid to fool the defenders into thinking the ship armed, were blown in. Worse, other shot was aimed at the waterline with the aim of sinking her, which, given she was in the main deep-water channel leading to the port, showed a want of brain on the part of whoever was in command.
"If she takes in a load of water, Mr. Neame, she will settle before we get to the towers."
The old ship's master nodded to Sykes, trying to calculate the point at which he could abandon ship when it was clear the 74 was going to end up where he wanted it, blocking the harbour entrance. But it was becoming obvious that time was not a luxury the gunners on the sea wall were about to allow him. So far, the quarterdeck, where he and Sykes stood, had been spared, but that could not last. The open entry port was on the main deck below their feet, on the side of the ship pointing away from those guns.
"Best abandon now, Mr. Neame," added Sykes. "No sense in getting cut in half for what we can't achieve."
Neame nodded and began to lash off one side of the wheel, Sykes doing the other. They were halfway to the companionway, crouching and running, just as a ball screamed across the deck and hit the wheel square on the middle of the spokes, reducing it to matchwood, and even though they continued to run, it was with the knowledge that they had just had a very lucky escape. Once on the main deck, they were far from safe. The La Rochelle defences boasted 42-pounder cannon, and at the short range at which they were firing, that was a ball that could come right through the several feet of timber that made up the Apollon's scantlings. One ball, heated shot, flaming red, flew through a gunport ahead of them and smashed into the seaward side of the ship, embedding itself and beginning to smoulder the surrounding wood. On the deck of HMS Pharaon, Digby was again producing a litany of silent curses. He found being a spectator harder than the notion of being in action, and he was praying that his master and boatswain would have the sense to get off in time. The relief when he saw the jolly boat emerge from behind the bulk of the 74 was palpable, though short-lived, as the lookout from the masthead yelled down to him,
"Mr. Harbin approaching Alpha Leather in the cutter, Captain, and he's flying a signal at the head of his mast." Digby was at the shrouds and climbing before the sentence was finished. This was no time for second-hand information. He had to see for himself. Given the speed with which Harbin was heading to rendezvous, he had his signal in view from the mainmast cap, and it was one of the messages which required no signal book to decipher. "Enemy in sight!" he shouted down to the deck, then looked towards the two men straining on the oars of the jolly boat, trying to calculate how long they would take to join before adding, "Prepare to weigh!" Not so long before this day, Lieutenant Henry Digby had been a skylarking midshipman, so sliding down a backstay to the deck, though it might not fit with the dignity of a ship's captain, was at least speedy enough to get him onto his quarterdeck in a flash. He had a glass on the jolly boat again, which had become a target for musket fire at extreme range. Apollon, now within the arc of the cannon on the towers of St. Nicholas and La Chaîne, was taking fire on the bows, which seemed to make the vessel jerk to a halt as they struck, only for it to resume its drift between salvos. Thick smoke came from below, pouring out of the gun-ports, this while the whole of her upper works were being blasted with shot that hardly needed any aim to strike home. The mainmast was struck and lurched to one side, held momentarily by the rigging until, in slow motion, it went by the board. Switching his glass, Digby looked through the gap on those towers, hoping to see John Pearce emerge with his party. If they came with the condemned Frenchman, that was good, but without would do. The threat to kill Raffin would have been useless if the man had shown an ounce of courage. At least he did not plead, no doubt because he knew it to be useless, as he was hurried down to the quay, passing by very much the same folk who had watched Pearce and his men march by earlier. This time, when they looked, it was with jaw-dropping wonder, as the party of seeming National Guards and one British officer, with that flag of truce still held over his head, hurried by, a sight which distracted them from the sight, as they looked out to sea, of a capital warship drifting in, bits of timber flying off as it was pounded, its prow aimed straight for them. That was a sight for the rescue party as well, and one that stopped Gerard Moreau in his tracks as with a pained expression he recognized his own ship being torn to bits. "Captain Moreau!" Pearce shouted, grabbing his arm. "We must keep moving. Mr. Famelot, we are in need of a boat that we can row. You choose." There was a moment when, rushing up the side of the quay, they approached the decks of the pair of privateers Pearce had seen preparing for sea the day before, when it might have all gone wrong. Many of the crew, having seen them coming a long way off, looked to a weapon to interdict them as they passed. But the screeching orders of whoever commanded rang out, telling them to concentrate on casting off and getting out of the harbour before the entrance was blocked. By the time Pearce and his prisoner stumbled by, the cables had been slipped from the bollards and men were poling the ships away from the stone quay. This while others pushed sweeps out of the low gun-ports to act as oars. "Ahead, sir!" Famelot shouted. "The size of a decent cutter."
The boy was pointing towards a large, clinker-built fishing boat, festooned with fenders, in which a fellow, seemingly oblivious to what else was happening in the place, was untangling his nets. His boat had a single mast and boom, as well as half a dozen rowlocks aside, indicating it was a reasonably deep-water fishing smack. With so many men it would be crowded, but it would do, so Pearce gestured to Costello and Martin to get forward and see to the fisherman, who was roughly bundled out of the way as first Fairmelo, then the rest of the party, clambered down into his boat. The protests he began to make died in his throat as a musket was levelled at him. Pearce could not believe they had got this far without having to fight, and it was only when he looked back he realized why. A solid phalanx of French sailors, 20 deep, was walking slowly along the main quay, blocking any attempt by Raffin's supporters to get by them. "Now, monsieur, you will get down into the boat, and you will do so in the knowledge that I still have my pistol trained on you." That was when Pearce caught sight of the tortured face of Captain Jacquelin, clearly in an agony of indecision. He was the only one Pearce thought he had to worry about, the only one who might see his duty as an attempt to get Raffin free, and by doing so save himself from the guillotine. He had only moments, the time needed for him and Moreau's men to get the oars out and rigged for use. "Captain Jacquelin, if you wish to stay out of the boat, you are free to do so. Perhaps you have so much affection for your home soil that you would risk your neck to stay here." The man looked at him with a hard glare until Pearce added, "But do not attempt anything, because if you do, not only will this bastard die, but so will you. Make up your mind, go or stay." Jacquelin responded by sitting down amidships between two of his own fellows who had got their oars in place. "Slowly, Raffin. Michael, when he's down, get him in the bow and standing." The representative on mission was handed down into the boat and so placed. Pearce joined him, spreading his own feet wide and taking his collar to keep him upright. "Cochon," Pearce said in his ear, a remark the man resented by the way he stiffened. He was not used to being called a pig. "We have to get out between St. Nicholas and La Chaine, and there are men on the ramparts who will be tempted to shoot down on us. One musket ball fired and you die, so clear your throat and get ready to call out." "You will kill me anyway," Raffin replied, for the first time showing some spunk. This as Dysart and Costello pushed off, and the men on the oars began to row with more confusion than rhythm. "No, we are not like you. Let us say we are like the majority of your countrymen. Do as I say, and we will let you live, and perhaps you will learn to grant the same gift to others." HMS Farron had sailed over her anchor, plucking it out of the soft sand that lined the sea floor as sweet as kiss my hand. And once Neame and Sykes were aboard, no more than a few minutes after, Digby gave the orders that would bring her round to close with Harbin, sailing close to the wind on the larboard tack. "Aloft there! A sharp eye out to sea for whatever it is that has got Mr. Harbin so agitated." "Is my presence on the deck permitted, sir?" Digby just nodded to Lutyens, and kept his telescope trained on the distant horizon, the face behind it definitely worried. "Am I allowed to ask about Pearce and his men?" "You are, Mr. Lutyens, as long as you do not look for an answer. The safety of the ship comes first. If what is out there has to be avoided at all costs, then Mr. Pearce will just have to take his chances." Lutyens did not respond with an opinion, and in truth he had no idea if the men who had gone ashore had achieved what they set out to do or failed. But it was silent speculation that would have troubled the captain if said out loud. What would happen to them if they were taken by a group of people quite prepared to slaughter their own naval officers on a set of trumped-up charges? There could only be one answer. "He appears to have a streak of luck in such situations, Captain Digby," Lutyens said, more to reassure himself than the man he was addressing. "Let us hope it holds." "T'gallants on the horizon, Captain!" "Excuse me, Mr. Lutyens, I need to see this for myself." Digby went to the shrouds again, and began to climb. Lutyens walked to the taffrail, passing Mr. Neame on the way, to look back at the pillar of smoke rising from the burning Apollon. The master was close enough to exchange words with him, and so set in his course that he could join him in looking back to the diminishing outline of La Rochelle.
"If Mr. Pearce ain't out of that harbour in a few minutes, he ain't never going to get out."
Looking at the older man, and seeing that his attention had returned to a close examination of the sky and the cloud formations out to sea, he asked what they portended.
"See how the high clouds is breaking up, Mr. Lutyens, into those odd oblong shapes?"
"I do."
"Lenticular, we calls it, and that is a forewarning of foul weather to come. The high winds are from the southwest, so that will be what we face. Common at this time of year."
"When?"
12 hours, maybe half a dozen more if we're lucky. But in these waters, with that sky, given we can't seek shelter, we shall be running for deep water as fast as we can. At the very least, we need to get well clear of Oleron, which is not going to be gifted us if we have to fight another ship."
"There must be an alternative."
"There is. Weather the Ile de Ré, which is that long sandbar to our north. Then set a course to run with the wind and hope to get it so far out into blue water that, even if it lasts a week, we can weather Ushant. Trouble is, it seems there's folk out there who want to stop us doing that."
"Can we avoid a fight?"
"Mr. Lutyens, they have the wind. The choice of fighting does not lie with us, it lies with them. And if they do choose to engage, and we carry anything away aloft, even if we escape, we will be in real danger. With that weather, and where it is coming from, and the strength of the gale it might be, it could be us that don't get out of here."
Obviously, Lutyens thought, the chances for John Pearce and his party had just plummeted. Having pulled out towards the middle of the harbour, the men in the fishing boat were presented with the sight of Apollon perilously close to plugging their route of escape. Fairmellow started to chant in order to get the oars to synchronize, and this had some effect, speeding up the boat as the oars bit the water more evenly, even though they were pretty low in the water with so many souls aboard, and not in a vessel designed for speed, so they would never reach a satisfactory pace.
"Them slopes is beginning to make way,"
Martin Dent said. He was in the thwarts holding the tiller, but looking backwards, Fairmellow still chanting beside him.
"Once we's out in deep water with them sweeps out, they's like to overhaul us."
Silence fell as everyone aboard who could understand absorbed the information, because the time must come where the threat of a ball through Raffin's head might not work. Indeed, they were coming abreast of that now, as they approached the towers that guarded the entrance, with musketeers leaning over both ramparts, their weapons trained. Pearce pressed his pistol hard against Raffin's head and hissed, "Time to sing, cochon!" The shout was as loud as that he used to harangue the crowd earlier, and it was an order not to shoot on pain of certain death. Pearce was less concerned with that than the rapidly closing gap in front of him. Apollon, now well alight along the length of her larboard side, was within a few dozen yards of the towers, still being hit repeatedly by gunfire, and her head was slightly down, showing him more of the deck than she should. If she came on and jammed her bulk into the gap, there would be no room to escape. The ship was drifting so slowly that, when she ran aground, it was hard to spot. A slight sway forward of the upper foremast, a dip of the smashed stump of the bowsprit. But softly aground she was, with room for Pearce and his men to row through into the billowing pall of smoke that was being driven inland on the breeze.
"Steer us to the seaward side, Martin. Those cannon could be trained on us if we stray down the other."
"Aye, aye, sir."
"So you do know your manners,"
gasped Costello, pulling on his oar. Pearce glanced over his shoulder to see that the sloop in pursuit had stopped working the sweeps and had let fly the falls on the sail it had raised. Men were jumping off the deck into a cutter, which, properly manned, would have little trouble in overhauling them, so they were not out of danger yet. They were in a cloud of acrid smoke, every man-jack aboard coughing, which also cut off from view the tower of St. Nicholas right above them, and the boat in their wake. Pearce knew he was very close to the stone jetty on which he had first landed, so close that it would be possible for someone on it to attempt to bar their progress. But would they risk it? His heart was in his mouth until the smoke cleared and he could finally see where he was heading, down the flank of Apollon, safe for the moment from the guns of the sea wall.
"Once we see Feron, Martin, steer straight for her. We will have to take a chance on those cannon, for there's no way of getting out of range."
Peering out to sea, it was only a minute before he saw his own ship, and it was clear that she was sailing away with as much speed as she could make.
"A corvette, Mr. Neame," said Digby as he came back on deck. 16 cannon on her main deck, bow and stern chasers, and she's clearing for action."
"How does she sail, sir?" Neame asked.
"With the wind on her beam, she looks as good a sailor as any ship would, and I observed no change in her sail plan, so how she will handle in a fight I do not know."
"Have you observed the cloud formation, Captain?"
"Your opinion would be valuable."
That was a neat way of Digby telling Neame he was uncertain, but that was also the reason a king's ship had a sailing master, more steeped in knowledge of the sea, the weather and its vagaries than a commissioned officer, whose job it was to fight. Neame explained his thinking, downplaying the notion that they might have the best part of a day to get enough of a southing to get well clear of the Ile d'Oléron. If they had more time than he thought, good, but it was not something to base sound judgment on. As they discussed the meaning of that problem, there came the other of getting the cutter hooked on and Harbin and his men aboard, there being no way to do that without backing the sails and virtually bringing HMS Feron to a dead stop. The cry from the masthead, as the cutter clattered clumsily into the side, that it looked as if Mr. Pearce was in a deep-laden fishing boat and had cleared both the harbour and the burning Apollon, was just another thing to worry about.
"Your opinion, Mr. Neame?"
"If his boat is deep in the water, it argues he has the Frenchman with him."
Digby nodded at that and called to his freckle-faced midshipman as he clambered aboard.
"Mr. Harbin, get the animals into the cutter and have it towed astern, then report to me. I want your impressions of that ship we face."
"I have no notion of any plan you might be thinking of, Your Honour."
Digby's laugh was an interruption.
"I am short of a plan, Mr. Neame."
"Well, sir, that Frenchman outguns us, not by much, I will say, but he has more weight of shot nevertheless."
"But how does he handle them?"
"That's as unknown as how he sails, but I would say that standing off to fight him with cannon is not an option, quite apart from the fact that we have the means to give him a shock if we range up close."
"Mr. Pearce's love of a carronade may pay a dividend."
"But to truly beat the fellow, if he's any good, we may need to board, and that requires numbers."
Digby nodded slowly, then said in a dispassionate tone that must be at odds with his feelings,
"Bring us about, Mr. Neame. Let us close with Pearce's boat and get our men aboard."
"And the changing weather, sir?"
"One risk at a time, Mr. Neame."
Pearce had been watching HMS Feron with a sinking feeling that got worse the greater the gap between them. They were out past the 3-anchored 74s now, and he had Raffin on his knees, the motion of the boat on the swell too pronounced to remain standing. Behind him the cutter from the privateer rowed steadily along, keeping a distance, but with the means to close at any time, armed men aboard ready to fight them if the occasion arose. Could he trade Raffin for safety? Or would such a policy result in certain capture? For he could see no way how any arrangement he could make, some kind of parole, could be trusted to hold with such a murderous radical. Raffin could say he would exchange his freedom for theirs, but renege as soon as he had the advantage.
"Only way to do it, Your Honour," said Dysart when he opened up the problem to them all, "is to take half their sticks off them as well. Then they'll no be able to keep up with us."
"For how long?" Costello responded. "The oars will float. They will get 'em back on board, and with Feron sailing away, they will have all the time in the world to close with us."
Dysart reluctantly acknowledged the truth of that, and a deep gloom descended over men who had no doubt what they faced if taken. It was Fairmeadow, who had never taken his eyes off their ship, who cried out that she was coming about, and looking forward they could all see that she was halfway round, presenting her side instead of her stern. The cheer was not just from English throats. Most of the French sailors cheered too, and Moreau had that grin on his face again, which cheered Pearce up immensely. "Perhaps now, Dysart, your notion has merit." Pearce, slowing, called out to the pursuit, offering the exchange if they ditched 4 of their 8 oars, which led to a long discussion, which could only have come about because their mothership was a privateer, and thus a decision had to be collective. All the time Pearce was glancing over his shoulder to see HMS Pharaon coming on, hand over fist, trying, and he thought failing, to work out the time needed for them to be close enough to threaten that cutter and the contentious souls manning her. Eventually the exchange was agreed, and half the oars were shipped out of their rowlocks to float inshore on the still rising tide. They would have to come about to retrieve them, and that would take time. But there was one other way to slow them down. "Monsieur, stand up and let your rescuers see you. Costello, throw off those fenders." Having listened to the exchange, Raffin knew what was about to happen, and he looked to the men rowing the boat he was in to raise their oars. He waited in vain. "Can you swim?" As Raffin shook his head, Pearce said, "Je suis désolé," and taking him by the collar and tail of his black coat, he threw him into the water, as close to those fenders as he could. Chapter 23. The only thing that floated at first was his hat, though the sod did come up for air twice before they got to him, and he had all the appearance of a drowned rat as they hauled him in. Digby was only half listening to Pearce. They had come about again, and were once more closing with the enemy, now hull up, identified by the Frenchman Pearce as Pandarus, who, with the weather gauge, had gone down to topsails very quickly, a luxury denied to his opponent, still forced to beat up into the wind in order to gain the kind of sea-room both captains would see as necessary for the forthcoming fight. The route northwest was closed to them by the Ile de Ré. To head due south was to take them closer to the anchorage of the Aix roads, not a pleasant prospect, which would make even harder the task of weathering the Ile d'Oléron. "I think, Mr. Pearce, had you known we faced an enemy at sea, you might have rather seen the fellow drown." Pearce could not believe that Digby had any anticipation of being beaten. It went against the grain of the man and the service of which he was part. Yet it was obvious from his tone that he had calculated the prospect of such an outcome, and the obvious corollary of what might follow should they be taken into La Rochelle anchorage as a captured enemy vessel. For Moreau et al., it would be the guillotine for certain, and he, following on from the treatment he had meted out to Raffin, could not feel safe from a similar fate. "As it is, I look to you to ensure that our French friends understand that they too must be prepared to fight." "I would say they are too aware of the alternative not to." "I would be obliged if you could confirm it." The French officers were gathered in a knot in the forecastle, watching the approach of what should have been a friend. Pearce had the distinct impression the subject he was about to broach had already been discussed, but it was on quite another matter that Moreau engaged him. The approaching change in the weather, plus the fact that, being from the Breton port of Concarneau, he knew only too well what those elongated cloud formations portended. "The captain is aware of that, but you will see our way is barred." "Might I suggest that he attempts to get to windward of Pandarus and then tries to outrun her?" Without a fight in which you might be compromised, Pearce thought. But he said, "I will pass on your comments, but you know that is not why I have come to speak with you." Moreau nodded. "A dilemma, I think." "If you are prepared to fight, Captain Digby is prepared to give you the means. If not, we must find somewhere below to keep you secure." "Our own countrymen? And where will we go, even if your captain wins?" "We,
That corvette and the weather permitting, will make all sail for the Straits of Gibraltar and Toulon." "Do you still have your flag of truce?" Pearce nodded. "Then I would like the use of it, to speak to the captain of Pandarus, and see if we can find an alternative to a battle in which I must fight men who should be my comrades." Digby's refusal to consider the request was so emphatic as to make any discussion pointless, and Pearce, who would have said the same, was treated to a sharp and near-public reminder that his duty lay to the flag at the masthead, not the Frenchman he had fetched aboard. It was really the first time he had seen his captain angry, and the words he used, though they contained certain truths, were not easy to swallow without the temptation to deliver an equally sharp response. "Just because you have no care for your own commission, Mr. Pearce, does not mean that you can play ducks and drakes with the prospects of others. I have set my course for a life in His Majesty's service, and I have spent 8 years working to get to my present rank. I do not believe for a moment, as matters presently stand, I shall survive as a master and commander on my return to Toulon, so I will revert to being just another lieutenant on a very crowded list. And it may have escaped your attention, but it has not mine, that we have abandoned 3 capital ships I would hazard are, at this very moment, being remanned to sail them away from a lee shore on which they must face certain destruction, something unlikely to raise my profile with lordhood or the Admiralty. Yet if you best that corvette—" There was no need either to finish the sentence or for Digby to answer. If he won a single-ship action against what was a superior force, he would be made. It might not gain him post-rank and a rated ship, but no admiral would shift him from his present situation with such a victory under his belt. Pearce, stung by Digby's rebuke, added, "I dare say you are comfortable risking the lives of everyone aboard to enhance your own prospects of advancement." Digby flushed angrily, and in truth Pearce regretted the words as soon as he spoke them, for had he not just risked 6 lives to rescue Moreau and his associates? It was that old devil in him. He would not be talked down to by anyone, even a man he quite admired. "Mr. Pearce!" A second interruption was very necessary to stop Digby before he made this spat so serious that neither would be able to step back. "Forgive me, sir. What I just said was unwarranted, and I would like to withdraw the insinuation." "Sir," said Neame, "if I could draw your attention to the enemy. The point is coming where you need to tell us what we are to do." The old man's intervention was, in terms of discipline, worse than the words Pearce had used, and in reality, given the rates of sailing and the fact that his opponent was drawing him out into deeper water, action could not be joined before the glass had run through at least twice. An argument between commissioned officers was one thing. A barbed comment from a warranted ship's master, however old and able, was enough to cause real friction. Yet Digby did nothing for a moment, possibly seeing it for what it was, a way to stop his superiors continuing the argument. "I thank you for reminding me, Mr. Neame. Mr. Pearce, you will oblige me by asking Captain Moreau what he intends. If he will not fight, he and his men must be confined. There is no alternative. Mr. Neame, your opinion on what our opponent will do." Pearce only realized halfway to the forecastle that he had been the subject of a snub. Digby should have asked him first, and he had not. Yet he could not continue to be angry with a man who had shown him much kindness, had never once publicly alluded to his lack of knowledge, who had indeed gone out of his way to help him absorb the duties which went with his rank, both on deck and over books in his cabin. So he would attend his guns and fight as best he could, because the responsibility of success or failure did not lie with him, and it was, no doubt, a burden felt keenly by the man who had it. Moreau made it a matter of individual conscience, so that half the French officers went below to be confined, while the other half, with the captain of Apollon at the head, were issued with cutlasses. Looking back along the deck as he made his way to his station, he was impressed by the calm demeanour of the gunners, the midshipmen, and the 2 men in close discussion on the quarter-deck. Was it Neame who hinted that Digby had gone too far, or was it the captain himself? Whatever, he was summoned for an opinion, and with the yards braced right round, the sight from the wheel, a clear view of the enemy,
was not encouraging. "I doubt I can add much." "Nonsense, Mr. Pearce. You have seen action, I have not." "Does not our friend yonder have all the choices?" "Not all. He has the advantage, certainly. But how will he use it?" "He should try to keep the wind," said Pearce. "Even I know that. So I suspect he will seek to cross our bow and rake us when we are struggling to reply, in the hope of hitting something vital." "Then?" "If he fails in that, he should put up his helm and invite us to attack." "At which point," Digby continued, "he will let fly his sheets, come about, and fetch us another broadside, with enough time and way on his ship to resume his course and stay clear until he had wounded us enough to surrender the weather gauge and seek to get across our stern. It is Mr. Neame's opinion that Pandarus will be a ship set to guard the Rochefort approaches, and therefore near continuously at sea, so the crew will be efficient on the sails, yet possibly less so on their armaments." "At this stage, sir," Neame added, "I guess more than an opinion, I would point out once more that neither we nor the enemy commander have much time for anything, with the promise of a southwesterly gale in the offing. These waters are his, and he must know what that cloud formation means. So for him, too, if the business is to be done, it must be done with alacrity." "We must get close, sir." Digby's smile was grim. "I fear he will not let us, Mr. Pearce." "Can we not fool him?" Pearce suddenly remembered and made mention of the incendiary devices they had made up to burn the French 74s. The appearance of Pandarus had made any attempt to use them impossible, but they were still available.
"Fire is a hazardous thing aboard ship," Neame insisted.
"Yet smoke and seeming panic on our deck may make Pandarus act precipitately." Seeing the uncertainty, Pearce pressed home his point to Digby. "I think we can assume he knows, as we do, that time is pressing. He will want to take us hold as much as you would want to take him as a prize. So let us show him he is in danger of total loss." "You think he will seek to save the ship rather than see it burnt to the waterline?" "Flames and smoke could be accompanied by the useless discharge of cannon, as though the powder in the touch-holes had been set alight by a blaze. If he thinks we're on fire, and that we cannot use our guns, he will be bound to range alongside to try and board, with the aim of putting out the conflagration and taking the ship as a prize. If he comes that close, he will be at our mercy, ready to board instead of sitting off with his guns manned."
"If it is to be done," said Neame, "it must be done now, or their lookouts will see everything."
Digby never got the chance to finish his nod. Pearce called for Harbin and Famelow, as well as the men he had led ashore, with instructions to one mid to get all the cook's coppers, and the other to take from him every ounce of slush he had, and damn the fact he would lose by not being able to sell it. The copper cauldrons were rigged by lines across the forecastle, so they did not touch the deck. A square of canvas laid underneath as a precaution. "Dysart, Costello, get the fire engine up here into the bows. I want it played on the base of that canvas, and if it shows any sign of spreading to the timbers, douse the coppers with water." He had the Pelicans, Latimer, and Blubber fetch up the incendiaries, used turpentine to soak the sacking and tow to be carried on pieces of damp canvas into the bows, so the smoke they created would blow back over her deck. "The captain of Pandarus will be wondering what we're about, will he not?" Pearce pointed to Moreau and his fellows, watching what was happening with bemused expressions. "The captain of Apollon is no wiser, I hope." Digby was looking back to the near invisible shore, to the pall of smoke that rose higher and higher in the sky. Yet it was clear at the base, broken from the land, so he had to assume the fire had been contained. Right now they would be trying to refloat the ship and tow her clear, to free the shipping in the harbour. Another reason to avoid being tardy. The tide had not finished rising when she went aground. Plug the holes, pump hard, and she might lift from the seabed. A couple of cutters could then tow her far enough off to open the entrance, so bigger vessels than a cutter could exit. A couple of well-armed and handled privateers, added to Pandarus, and HMS Farron would be done for. "Mr. Neame,
I know the masthead is a perilous position in a fight, but I need someone aloft to keep an eye on the prospect of those privateers Mr. Pearce mentioned emerging from La Rochelle. Martin Dent, get aloft. Keep an eye out dead astern for any sign of a sail.
If the boy knew that it was a point of danger, given the French generally tried to dismast an enemy, it made no difference to him. He went aloft with his usual cat-like speed. Pearce was still working in the bows, rigging a run of canvas to screen the cook's deep copper pots. He also had a tub of slow match fetched forward, his aim to light the incendiary devices as soon as their ship was in receipt of a broadside. Meanwhile, Harben and Farmelow were going around the deck with his instructions to the crew to pretend to panic as soon as the smoke became thick enough to make them cough. Down below, Lutyens, his instruments laid out in readiness, wondered at the amount of running feet he could hear through the planking. An inquiry to a sailor gave him the information that while the enemy was closing, it would be half a glass of sand before they engaged, so he went up to the quarterdeck. Once explained, he gave the opinion that the men on deck should place something damp over their mouths to keep the smoke out, which led to a severe diminution in his stock of bandage. Digby, sensing the time had come, had a tot of rum served to each man to get some fire in their bellies.
"Range is closing, sir," called Neame. "I would say he'll be putting up his helm in no more than 5 minutes.
A final check was made. The carpenter was ready with well-tarred canvas, plugs, and mates to fix any hole in the hull. Sykes had men standing by for a fast repair of any vital rope or sail, and axes to cut away anything that, damaged, might imperil the ship, while the gunner, having filled all the cartridges he had available, and being a religious man of the Methodist persuasion, was praying to Almighty God to be spared. Digby had gone into his cabin and put in a weighted sack the ship's books and the list of recognition signals used by British warships to identify each other, and then he came back on deck to look at the half-dozen gloomy, cutlass-bearing Frenchmen in the waist.
"Lads," he shouted, "he can hit us, and all we can reply with are our bow-chasers. So when I shout to get down, I do not want you looking to see if I'm serious. Get flat on the deck immediately. If you do not know what Mr. Pearce is about, we are trying to fool the enemy, and I have to tell you, given that he has seen action and survived, we must assume that what he lacks in experience he makes up for in luck. So do as he orders, and we will win the day."
They cheered, but Digby was left to wonder if it was brought about by enthusiasm or rum, though when he gave the orders that took them down to topsails it was done with a normal level of efficiency. As an act, it was like a signal of intent to their opponent. The first ball from the bow-chasers of Pandarus sent out a thick cloud of black smoke, which, billowing forward from the onshore breeze, had Pearce asking for any rubbish powder or bottom-of-the-barrel grains the gunner might have to be brought up. It also reassured him. When the corvette fired a broadside, the smoke from their own cannon would obscure what was happening on his deck. The balls only fell short by half a cable, and the way the range was closing, it could only be minutes until the expected salvo came from his main battery. "An eye on his deck," Digby called to the men in the mainmast cap with muskets. "Let me know as soon as they move to let fly the sheets." Silence fell, with only the slight whistle of the wind in the rigging still audible, and even on open water everything came down to the closing gap between the two warships. When a voice from the masthead gave the alert, Digby shouted, and every man not an officer or midshipman dropped to their knees on the deck, Neame and the quartermaster on the wheel being the exception. The mighty crash of the guns was carried on the wind, and it had passed them by when the balls struck, high in the rigging, parting ropes and dislodging blocks which were caught in the rigged overhead nets. Sykes and his men were quickly into action, to splice a break or run a replacement line, and were still at that task when the second salvo came. A ball took one of Sykes's mates and plucked him off the rigging like a shot bird, carrying him screaming into the water, where he was certain to die.
"Belay that, Mr. Sykes," Digby called. "Get your men to a place of safety until something vital is wounded."
Smoke reached HMS Farron in a dispersing cloud, to mix with thicker stuff from the backblast of her own bow chasers. Pearce put the slow match to the incendiaries, and as they flared up, he ladled slush onto the flames, which produced a cloud of pungent smoke that had him spinning away to get his breath. "Order that deck!" he croaked as he nearly retched over the side. He made his way to the bowsprit side of his brew, and added more slush till the whole deck seemed to be in the grip of the smoke it created. Mentally he was counting. How long to discharge a gun and send a ball uselessly into the sea off the ship's side, that followed by a couple more? Would the captain of Pandarus be fooled? Would he close to try to take possession of the ship? Digby, before the smoke obscured his enemy, had seen the corvette come about and head away, slow enough to tease him to try and close, though it was obvious he could tighten his falls and increase his speed at will. Yet he also saw him check as the smoke rose from the bows, and if he could see the rising and flickering flames, then he had to assume his opposite number would too. Digby jerked involuntarily as first one, then a second cannon went off, arcing a pair of 9-pounder balls into the sea off the larboard beam, sending up telling waterspouts. This accompanied by frenzied shouting and a scene of apparent panic as men rushed around the deck. That must have decided him. The captain of the Pandarus let fly his sheets, hauled hard on his rudder, and started to come round on the wind in short order. "Mr. Harbin," Digby said in a calm voice, "please be so good as to inform Mr. Pearce that his ruse has worked. Get those guns run in and reloaded." "Topsails astern, sir," shouted Martin Dent. "Something's coming out of the port, and I reckon it's one of them privateers." "If there is one, boy," Digby said to himself, "there will be two." In terms of his present situation, it made no odds. He still had to engage the closest enemy vessel, but it did have an effect on the whole. He could not linger for fear of what was coming, and he dare not risk a gunnery duel in which he might have his ability to sail impeded by the loss of a mast. "Mr. Harbin, ask Mr. Pearce to join me." That took less than a minute, with Michael O'Hagan now fanning away at the flames and Rufus and Charlie ladling the slush, this while the rest of the crew kept rushing about. "Sir!" "Mr. Pearce," Digby said, then stopped to cough as a cloud of smoke enveloped him. "Earlier this day you alluded to my willingness to sacrifice the crew for my own advancement." Pearce had to take his wetted handkerchief from his mouth to reply, "A remark I withdrew, sir." "Indeed you did, yet the stigma mentioned preys upon me. Our masthead, as I'm sure you have heard, tells me that more vessels are coming out from La Rochelle, so if I stay and fight Pandarus, I suspect I am taking an unwarranted risk. Do you agree?" "Pandarus round and closing, sir," called Neame, seemingly unaffected by the smoke. "I am happy to abide with whatever decision you make, Captain." "That will not do, Mr. Pearce," Digby barked. "I want your opinion." Pearce's blood was up. His ruse had produced the desired result, and he felt in his bones they could take the slightly better-armed vessel. Yet he was aware of his excitement, aware he was thinking along the same lines which he had accused Digby of earlier, thinking of himself and not the needs of the ship and the men she carried. "We cannot face 3 opponents." "Obviously, Mr. Pearce, only I doubt they can close with us in anything less than an hour." "Yet can we face 2 if we sustain damage?" Digby shook his head, and it was with some effort that he responded. "Then I think, sir, that discretion is the better part of valour." A fit of coughing meant he had to wait for Digby's conclusion. "Thank you, Mr. Pearce. Now go back to your station on the larboard battery, and stand by to give our friend yonder a surprise." There was a wait to get to the point where the Frenchman was committed, the point where he could not change his mind. As soon as Digby reckoned that to be the case, he yelled out for everyone to get back to their stations. "Forward there! Get those coppels emptied over the side!" Hands wrapped in thick canvas, the Pelicans obliged, though Charlie, ever fly, was wise enough to hide the remaining slush, which would come in handy to ease down his throat the hard ship's biscuit. As the flaming sacks hit the water, they fizzled and died, and they took with them most of the smoke. Digby could see his opposite number gesturing and pointing, he was so close, and the agitated way he was acting was evidence he had been severely discomforted by the sight before him. A disciplined deck with manned guns waiting to rake him. He screamed an order that, though it could not be heard, had his crew, lined up with pikes, axes, and swords to board, running for their cannon. Had the captain of Pandarus held his course, he would have endured only an exchange of broadsides. That he put up his helm and tried to turn into the wind was not only stupid, it was dangerous, because he diminished the arc of fire available to his own guns, and created a corresponding increase in the target left to the cannon of HMS Farron. Added to that, he had brought himself into range of one of Pearce's carronades, and though the 9-pounders did damage, sending great chunks of wood and splinters flying, it was that stubby weapon that did the real injury. Pearce waited until the stern of Pandarus came abreast, and then sent the huge ball through the deadlights. Those were smashed to pulp, as were the casements they protected, and the ball carried on along the main deck, the screams that came across the water evidence of the death and destruction being inflicted. "Mr. Neame, take me alongside the enemy, if you please. Mr. Pearce, when you are reloaded, I want elevation on your cannon. Let us see if we can ensure we stop any chance of a pursuit." Pandarus was wounded, but she was not out of commission, and Digby was being obliged to sail past her undamaged side to get clear, and that had loaded and unfired cannon. His opponent had the same notion as he. Digby wanted a mast brought down to cripple the corvette. The Frenchman wanted the same for HMS Farron. The only difference was in the discipline of the firing. Farron's crew were steady on a ship that had suffered little damage, the French on a deck that had taken casualties. Added to that, Digby had his first broadside fired early, which further disrupted the enemy gunners, as they were assailed by falling ropes and tackle. But most telling was the speed with which Farron's gunner reloaded, the same advantage Britannia usually enjoyed against Gaul, the number of broadsides they could get off in a short time. Pandarus's fire was slow and well aimed, though not well enough to wound a mast, albeit the amount of debris that came through the nets had Neame and Digby looking aloft with alarm. Yet as the French were reloading, they took another broadside, and this time, without instruction, Pearce had ordered the wedges driven out to lower the aim. Half of the Frenchman's bulwark disappeared, while the clanging sounds of struck guns was clearly audible, and such was the effect on those conning the ship that the corvette fell away as the rudder was put down, either deliberately or in panic. It made no odds. HMS Farron was clear, and even before Henry Digby called for a report on damage and casualties, he gave loud orders to set all possible sail and set a course to clear the tip of the Ile d'Oléron. Chapter 24. The screaming southwesterly came upon them later than Neame had anticipated, a full 18 hours from the point at which he had raised the matter of those lenticular clouds with his captain, and it came with a force that precluded any form of advance. Huge waves, with crests hundreds of yards apart, rolled in from the deep waters of the Atlantic, as high as the caps on the masts, forced forward by a wind that had only one virtue. It was steady, while above their heads dark grey clouds scudded along, blocking out the sun and creating a false twilight in the early morning sky. Having cleared the Ile d'Oléron before the tempest struck, they had made good progress, and were now, Neame informed Digby, abreast of the Gironde estuary, though well out to sea, with only a scrap of canvas aloft to try and maintain steerage way. "I suggest, sir," he yelled, "that we up our helm and make for shelter. This will get worse before it gets better, and we are already close to being driven north and west. If it continues for any length of time, all our efforts to clear the lee shore will be wasted." "Do we not risk the same on the northern shore at Royan?" "The Gironde is 13 miles wide at the estuary,
and wider yet past the Pointe de la Chambrette, and this wind will carry us in its speed if we run before it. I am sure we can weather the Pointe de Grave and drop anchor in the Verdun Bay, which is sheltered from the southwest."
In Digby's cabin it was less noisy, but the bucking motion of the ship as it rode those great rollers, and the water running off their oilskins, made examining a chart difficult. To leave the deck at such a juncture made little difference. The 4 men on the wheel, who included for his muscle Michael O'Hagan, had no other task than to keep HMS Farran's head into the wind, with young Harbin in command. As for the rest, double stays had been rigged on the masts before the storm developed. The hatches, bar one, were battened down. There were relays of men manning the pumps, and Boatswain Robert Sykes had everything in hand to repair any unforeseen damage. The crew snatched what sleep they could, and right now, having been on deck and working for 12 hours as they prepared the ship for the coming storm, John Pearce and Fermelo were having 4 hours' well-earned rest. The spread chart showed the northwest-facing estuary, with the great hook of the Pointe de Grave poking up like a claw that protected the river behind it from the blow they were facing. But Digby was quick to point out the one obvious flaw in Niam's suggestion when he placed a finger on the chart that showed a French fort commanding the very bay Niam was suggesting as an anchorage. "Quite apart from that, Mr. Niam, we will be in enemy waters, and while I accept that Bordeaux is not a naval station, it is a commercial port, and must of necessity have warships to guard it, and some kind of military garrison."
"I would suggest, sir, that they cannot be out to sea for the same reason as us, it being too dangerous. And if I had the choice in such weather, I would retire well upriver, in fact all the way to the Bordeaux docks, rather than stay in deeper water when no enemy could possibly approach in strength."
"The fortress?"
"We still have a tricolor, do we not? And we are in a captured French vessel."
Digby smiled.
"I see Mr. Pearce and his methods have affected you, Mr. Niam."
The older man responded with some pride.
"I take that as a compliment, sir."
"It was meant as one, Mr. Niam, rest assured. But I am not sure that even that will serve. We cannot anchor for an indeterminate time without paying compliments to the fort and whoever commands it. Failure to do that will make them curious, and I cannot see how, if they come out to investigate, we can keep them convinced we are French. We can get out of range of their cannon, but we could not stop them sending word upriver."
"You said, sir, kindly, that I was thinking like Mr. Pearce."
"I did."
"Then I would like to rouse him out and put to both him and you this proposition.
That we ask Captain Moreau and his party to cooperate.
If they cannot convince a party of frogs that they are of the same nation, who can?"
"Why would they do that?"
"For the offer to put them ashore, sir, at a point of their own choosing, and one in which they will be in no danger of retribution."
"In which case we need Mr. Pearce to make the suggestion."
It was a groggy John Pearce who entered the cabin, clutching the bulkheads to keep himself on his feet until he made a chair that had been secured to the deck. He listened as Niam outlined his proposal, nodding slowly, his eyes red-rimmed with tiredness.
"I cannot see how a decision can be made without first consulting Moreau."
"Very true," Digby replied.
"Then someone must go and fetch him."
One of the things Pearce had noticed about Gerard Moreau was his swift intelligence. He could grasp a problem quickly and act upon it, which no doubt made him a good ship's officer. Another was his honesty, and while he accepted that the proposed ruse was tempting, he did point out that once committed, there would be no guarantee that one of his comrades, Jacquelin, for example, might not renege.
"I think I have a solution to that, Captain Moreau. Tell him that all the time he converses with his fellow countrymen, there will be a musket a few feet from his back."
"A dozen men?"
"We have a dozen muskets, and I will be on deck and understanding every word, as well as examining every gesture. In return, we will put you ashore anywhere you like between here and the Spanish border, which will allow you to go where you please, as long as you evade people like Raffin."
"I agree to put it to my officers," Moreau replied. "After all, anything must be better than a return to Toulon."
Coming about on such a wind was a risky manoeuvre. It had to be timed perfectly, and the sails needed to get steerage way with a gale on their quarter had to be sheeted home and drawing before a wave threatened to broach them to. It was so dangerous that, having been informed of the intention, all the French officers were on deck, a willing addition to the crew, prepared to render any assistance required, which had more to do with self-preservation than the prospect of the pretence that would follow if they made the Gironde. They had accepted the proposal to a man, and when questioned, Moreau had told Pearce why. Bordeaux might be a worse place to land than La Rochelle. They had no idea who controlled the town, but as one of the country's major commercial ports, the odds were on men having been sent from Paris. Having had one brush with such a creature, there was no appetite to face another, and if they were landed in some spot away from any towns, they would have a chance to make their way, individually or collectively, to a place where the danger of decapitation would be nil. Digby was on one side of the quarterdeck, Pearce on the other, both with arms hooked through the rigging to stay upright. The topmen were ranged along the upper yards, soaked to the skin, their bare feet on the slippery foot-ropes, bent over the timber, ready to release the ties on the mainsail, which would need to be quickly reefed if it was not to blow out of its bolt-holes. Others were forward on the falls that controlled the jib, which would have to be got up fast to force round the ship's head. Neame was on the wheel with 3 others, peering forward into the gloomy, spume-filled daylight, watching the waves as they rolled towards the ship, trying to time his turn away from the biggest, that measured by the lift of the bows to a point where he could not see anything but scud-soaked planking. There was no guarantee that a big wave would not be followed by another, just the odds that the next roller would be diminished in size by its predecessor. He stepped back from the wheel, to be replaced by Michael O'Hagan, and taking hold of a man-rope with one hand, he raised his speaking trumpet to his mouth. The bows reared up until he was pressed back hard into the bulkhead, and he waited till the ship hit the crest before shouting. The task of getting round had to be completed in the following trough, for if a big wave hit them beam on with no sail set, they would roll sideways and over, with buoyancy the only hope of survival. His orders were yelled out as the wave came amidships, so that HMS Pharaon was perched atop the crest like a toy on a fire mantle. The wheel swung, and a rudder that was practically clear of water moved easily, then bit hard as the ship began to drop into the trough, beginning to turn the bowsprit. Neame yelled again as they drove down towards the base, and up went the jib, what wind hit that in the veil of water, acting on it to turn the sloop's bows. They were 3/4 round, and lifting on the next wave when Neame ordered the mainsail dropped, and as they rose to the next crest, it was sheeted home, the ship driven by the strength of the gale that hit them to stay on that crest for what seemed an age, as HMS Pharaon took off like a greyhound. There was joy on the deck, but in the minds of those who knew, it was tempered by the thought that what happened next depended on Neame's navigational skills. If they were out of the position he supposed, and set a course based on wrong assumptions, they would be driven ashore by this very sea, and probably drown. "Thank God for the lighthouse," said Digby, as the glim from the burning wood showed once more on the spinning bowl. "Mind, we will have to shave the point damn close to have any chance of coming round into shelter. Time to rouse out Mr. Neame." Pearce went to get the exhausted master, and it took a lot of shaking to wake him from a deep slumber. But he was on deck before he was truly needed, taking the con and steering the ship to shave the point, which had deep water to within a 1/4 mile of the shore. The Tricolor was already aloft, so that those on watch in the estuary would see a French vessel making for a home port, and it was no more than 2 hours before Neame could put up his helm and adjust his sail plan to take them into the shelter of the landmass, the lighthouse now well astern. The wind was still strong. Apart from the point itself, the land was too low-lying to impede it much, But without that running sea they could manoeuvre easily, and within another hour, as darkness fell, they had dropped anchor out in the Bay de Verdun, choosing to do so well away from the fort at the western end. Digby set an anchor watch with Fairmelot in command, who had strict orders to keep a sharp eye out for anyone coming out from the shore, and sent everyone else to get some well-earned rest. It was Pearce who made sure his pelicans were armed with pistols and in a position to keep an eye on the French officers. A boat came out from the shore at dawn, to be greeted by Moreau acting as captain, Jacquelin as his mate, to assuage his pride, and the rest, Garnier and Fossé included, in the guise of ordinary seamen. Everyone else, apart from those set to kill anyone who betrayed them, stayed on the opposite side of the deck, ostensibly carrying out repairs. The officer from the fort seemed ready to accept the explanation offered, that the ship was carrying dispatches for Brest, and would get back to sea as soon as the weather moderated, adding, in a nice touch, that there were certain deficiencies in stores which needed to be made up, if the fort and the traders, most especially the local wine-growers, would not mind accepting the English gold they had captured from a merchant vessel in the Mediterranean. Thus, in a cabin so crowded that backs were pressed to the bulkheads, French and British officers, midshipmen, and the master had an excellent dinner, with fresh fish, new-plucked chickens, what an Englishman would have called a baron of beef, all washed down with outstanding Médoc clarets from further down the coast, of the kind and quality that in normal times only the rich could afford. That they got them for so little was evidence of the lack of rich men left in France, plus the fact that the better claret market, Britain and Ireland, was now, without smuggling, barred to the growers.
"It falls to me," said Gerard Moreau in his toast, which Pearce translated, "to thank you for saving our lives. It also falls to me to tell you that we are true Frenchmen and sailors and warriors, and though it would give us no joy, should we meet in future, we will do our very best to take whichever vessel you are on, and should it be unfortunately necessary, to kill you in the process."
Pearce tempered it slightly, because he knew that, for the likes of Moreau, pride had been wounded. Digby then toasted the sea and all who sailed on her, which was a sentiment with which they could all agree. It took 6 days for the wind to abate sufficiently to make sail, and that could not be achieved until they had taken the French officers to a point between the fishing villages of Talmont and Mortagne of the northern Gironde shore, and said farewell.
"Who knows what will become of us, monsieur?" said Moreau. "We will perhaps pretend to be ordinary sailors. We will certainly stay out of any town that seems to be in the hands of our raffin, and we will make our way back to our homes and wait to see what transpires."
"Just keep your head, my friend," said Pearce. Moreau nodded and grinned, as Pearce had the cutter pushed off the beach and out into deep water. He did not look back as they rowed back to HMS Pharaon. It was those rowing who saw that the Frenchmen lined the beach and stayed there, ever smaller figures, until the cutter was out of sight. It took a week to beat all the way back to the Straits, and with the favourable ingoing current there was no need to stop at the rock. Once through, that same wind, which had made hard their passage south, sped them towards Toulon, and it was with mixed feelings that Pearce, standing in the bows, saw once more the tip of Montferrand emerge from the clouds which covered its summit. As soon as they came into view, HMS Victory made their number and signalled for the captain to come aboard. Pearce had permission to also take a boat, and after dropping off Lutyens at the hospital, he went aboard HMS Britannia to seek the date for the day he would see Ralph Berkeley at his court-martial. No vessel could approach the anchorage of Toulon without engendering a degree of curiosity, and HMS Pharaon was no exception. At first, in the distance, with just her topgallants showing, she had raised speculations regarding reinforcements. But it was soon realized, as her topsails came into view, that she was too small to offer anyone ashore that comfort. Closer and hull up, she was recognized for what and who she was. No ship was quite like another, and sailors took pride in recognition. By the time she gained the Grand Rade, there was scarce an English-speaking soul ashore or afloat who did not know her identity. Even Ralph Barclay, on duty at Fort Mulgrave, knew of her return, and while the information was not received with anything passing for delight, he knew in his heart that matters had been taken care of which left him free from any threat from John Pearce. Toby Burns, off duty, sat in a dark and empty midshipman's berth, shuddered when he heard the news being passed by shouts through the lower deck. The thought of John Pearce back in Toulon, when he was bound to hear of the evidence given at the court-martial, did nothing to ease his fear that one day the man would get him alone and exact vengeance. He wanted to go to Ralph Barclay and ask to be sent home. The captain ignored him, and his aunt now barely exchanged a civil word, but shied away from the consequences. What would the people who had so praised him at home say if their boy hero came home to skulk in the country? The news came to Emily Barclay through Shenton, sent by Mr. Glaister, who, in obedience to her husband's orders, kept lookouts at the masthead of HMS Brilliant, even though she was tied up to the quay. Shenton had taken the occasion to once more glower at her, then at Cornelius Gerson, sat yet again on the casement lockers with the ship's logs and ledgers. Emily wondered at the thickness of the man's skin, given she felt she had made it plain that his constant occupancy of her husband's cabin when he was absent was unwelcome. "I dare say you will be happy to see so many of your husband's crew once more, Mrs. Barclay," said Gerson. Was that a smirk on his face? Emily was unsure, for he seemed to have an almost permanent sneer on the rare occasions when he actually spoke, instead of sneaking surreptitious looks at her from under those long blonde eyelashes, which clearly he suspected she could not see. And was there a double meaning in those words? "Mr. Gerson," his interruption was swift, and delivered with what he thought was a winning smile. "Could I not persuade you, Mrs. Barclay, to call me Cornelius?" The sharp reply wiped away the smile. "No, Mr. Gerson, you cannot. You are my husband's clerk, and it would be unfitting to be so familiar, given our respective positions. And might I add that I find your continual presence in this part of the ship, which is supposed to be the preserve of the ship's captain, equally inappropriate." "My dear Mrs. Barclay," Emily cut across him, unfazed by his expression of hurt. "You do not dare ask for the use of it when he is aboard, do you?" The reply that Cornelius Gerson wanted to give was not one that would be possible. An open declaration of his attraction would be fatal, though he was forced to admit that, even after many hours spent in this very cabin, he had not advanced one iota in his aim of seduction. Emily Barclay was a hard nut to crack, but such was his assurance in his own capabilities that he took her rebuffs as proof that the notion of dalliance was both acknowledged and discomforting. Yet he could not resist an attempt to puncture her conceit, just to let her know in no uncertain terms that if her husband refused to accept the world as it was, he did. "I wonder what John Pearce will make of the outcome of your husband's court-martial?" The implied meaning was made plain by the arch look Gerson used to accompany the words. For a man would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to realize how strained the atmosphere was between Captain Barclay and his wife. The reason for that strain no secret either. "Mr. Gerson, please take your ledgers and return to that place which you have been allotted in which to work." "If I have offended you, Mrs. Barclay," he protested, "I would not wish to have to ask my husband to issue the same request." Gerson did not move immediately. Instead, he was staring at her with what looked like increasing comprehension. Then the look changed to a pout of displeasure, a petulant expression which was near feminine. Emily thought it was because he was being chucked out of the cabin, but she was wrong. Gerson was pouting because of a sudden notion. Could it be that Emily Barclay had not taken John Pearce's side against her own husband through a desire to maintain the truth? Could it be there was another even more telling reason? The thought made him so angry he had to turn away, and he used the excuse of gathering up his books to keep his face and expression hidden. "I am sorry to have offended you, madam." It was said in such a way as to make Emily feel a pang of guilt. I assure you I will not trouble you again." As he left, Cornelius Gerson was thinking that was all she was ever going to get from him from now on. More trouble than she could ever hope to cope with. "Shenton," she called, looking at him hard and wiping a half-smirk off his face. Clearly, given his love of eavesdropping, he had heard the recent exchange. "Request a boat from Mr. Glaister. I wish to see Mr. Lutyens now that he has returned." The boat was ready quickly, and she was handed down to sit in the thwarts. The sailor in charge did not bat an eyelid, as she said, as soon as they were out of earshot of HMS Brilliant, "Take me to HMS Pharaon."
"Aye, aye, ma'am." "I demand to see the Admiral," John Pearce growled, trying to lean over the desk and by his height and weight threaten Hotham's secretary.
"You cannot."
"I must. I demand also an explanation."
The secretary, knowing that he had Marines within earshot, was not to be cowed.
"You can demand away, sir. The day a lieutenant can demand anything of a vice-admiral is not yet come. If you wish to see him, put it in writing, and wait."
Pearce wanted to take out his sword and cleave the man in two, but he knew it would achieve nothing. He had been lied to and humbugged, and what was worse, he did not know what had happened, so he forced himself into a more calm mode of address.
"It makes no odds what the verdict of the court was. It was a travesty and based on a lie. I shall demand that Captain Barclay face trial again."
The smirk that he got from the secretary made his blood boil even more.
"I have heard you are much taken up with spouting the law, Lieutenant Pearce, so it surprises me to find you so ignorant. Do you not know there is such a thing as double jeopardy?"
"What?"
"Precisely," the secretary hissed. "A man tried and acquitted cannot be tried again for the same offence. Captain Barclay was reprimanded, but that is all, and there is nothing you or anyone else can do about it."
"I shall go and see Lord Hood."
"Do so,"
was the reply, and it was given in the confidence that he would be wasting his time there too.
"I had his word, Heinrich. That swine Hotham told me to my face that there could be no trial without my presence and that of Michael, Charlie, and Rufus. His secretary was taking notes, and he was writing the words down as they were spoken."
"And?"
"I asked to see those, and I knew when he was so willing to show me that I was about to be humbugged. There was no record of that part of the conversation, so I asked for the depositions I and the others made. The sod looked at me as though I had just come out of the gates of Bedlam."
The words rang in his ears yet.
"What depositions?"
"Am I disturbing anything?" Both men turned to the doorway to see Emily Barclay standing there. Pearce had a flash of anger, quite prepared to put the blame for what had happened on her shoulders. After all, she was married to the brute who had escaped justice. Yet her words totally deflated that statement. "Lieutenant Pearce, I was told that you might be here. It is you I have come to see."
"Why, madam?"
"To apologize for my husband."
"Emily," said Lutyens quickly, with a look that was telling her to be guarded.
"I know it could be seen as a betrayal, but I attended the court-martial, even though he did not want me there, and when I did, I could see why. Everyone who gave witness did so with a pack of lies. My nephew, the new clerk, Gerson—"
"Gerson?" Pearce snapped. "Clerk?"
"Coyle, the master-at-arms, did not so much lie as protect himself, but Kemp was vicious." "Why are you doing this, my dear?" Lutyens asked softly. "From shame, Heinrich. My husband not only committed perjury, he induced others to do so on his behalf, and with the assistance of authority got out of the way those who could attest he was telling untruths. And in the process he has lied to me more than once, and on other occasions withheld things he should have shared. I wish you, Lieutenant Pearce, to know that I was not party to this deception."
"I never thought you were," Pearce said, unsure if that was the truth.
They looked at each other for several seconds, her eyes moist with sorrow at the revelations she had made, his still hard from the same. Yet there was admiration for her beauty, as well as sympathy for what it must have taken to come here and confess what she knew. Then he had an idea. "You said, madam, that Captain Barclay perjured himself." "He was not alone in that, sir. They all did." "Then the case is altered. A man cannot, under the law of double jeopardy, be tried for the same offence twice. But perjury, I happen to know, is a separate offence, and a far more damning one. If I have my way, I will have your husband and his witnesses tried for that offence, and locked up in a King's Bench prison or transported to Van Diemen's Land for the rest of their lives." "And what of your friends?" she asked. "The ones for whom you have gone to so much trouble?" The excited look immediately died in John Pearce's eyes, to be replaced with one of deep wretchedness. "I must go now, Mrs. Barclay, and tell them that I have once more completely failed them." "They will forgive you, I'm sure." "They may well that. The real question is, can I forgive myself?" Standing outside the hospital later, once Emily Barclay had departed, he looked at HMS Pharaon, riding on her anchor in the Grand Rade. He knew that the telling of what had happened would be hard, but not as hard as the remedy. Talk of getting Ralph Barclay into court on a charge of perjury was easy to say, but it would be damned difficult to accomplish. With a heavy heart and deep foreboding, he went to his own boat and gave orders to head back to the ship. Author's note: the story in A Flag of Truce has some basis in fact. There was a problem in Toulon with radical sailors from the Atlantic ports who had no desire to support the administration which had taken over the town and port. Lord Hood, for the sake of security, was obliged to ask Rear Admiral Trogoff for 4 seaworthy 74-gun ships which, stripped of their guns, would be used to transport the seamen to their home ports of Brest, Lorient and Rochefort. Not a policy that proved popular when it became known in London what he had been obliged to do. The act may well have led to hints that he should retire, thus proving how difficult it was, in the days of long time-lag communication, for a commanding admiral to know what course to adopt on a foreign station. Sad to relate that many of the officers who refused to serve de Trogoff fell victim to the revolution they had attempted to support. Some were accused of treason and executed in the port of their arrival, while others were transported to Paris to be tried by a revolutionary tribunal, then guillotined in one of the great public squares in front of the usual howling mob. The revolution, by the time they made their landfall, was already eating its own. You have been listening to A Flag of Truce. It was written by David Donachie and read by Peter Wickham. Other recordings by David Donachie include An Awkward Commission, The Devil's Own Luck, and By the Mast Divided. This has been a Soundings Audiobooks presentation.